Elon Musk played Dungeons & Dragons with Trey Parker, then voiced himself on the show. One of the very few celebrities South Park ever let inside. Then in 2025, a character snorting ketamine and destroying the government started making headlines for looking exactly like him. And that is where it gets interesting. This is South Park versus Elon Musk. Section 1. Handy Car and the Friendly Beginning. For the first several years South Park was on the air, most of the celebrities who appeared in it or were mocked by it responded in one of three ways. They either pretended not to have seen it, they issued a statement of disapproval through a publicist, or they threatened legal action. Very few of them laughed along publicly. Even fewer ever became actual friends with Trey Parker and Matt Stone, two men who had built an entire career out of treating fame itself as something faintly ridiculous. The list of people who crossed that line between target and genuine acquaintance is short enough to count on one hand. Elon Musk made it onto that list, and the way he got there is the part of this entire story that makes everything that came later so much more complicated than a simple joke about a powerful person. The year was 2014. South Park was in its 18th season. A lot had changed since the show first aired in 1997, and a lot had stayed exactly the same. The format was unchanged. The town was unchanged. The four boys were still 9 years old in a world that kept aging around them. What had changed was the cultural landscape the show was operating inside. By season 18, South Park was no longer the most shocking thing on television the way it once had been. Cable had changed. The internet had changed. The show had survived long enough to watch the culture it once startled catch up to the place it had always been standing. And Parker and Stone responded to that shift by turning their attention towards something that felt genuinely new and genuinely worth examining in the fall of 2014. That something was the disruption economy. The episode that brought Elon Musk into the South Park universe for the first time was called Handy Car, and it aired on October 15th, 2014. The premise is simple enough to explain in a single sentence. Timmy Birch, one of the recurring supporting characters who uses a wheelchair and has limited speech, launches a ride-sharing service using his own wheelchair as the vehicle, attaching a small wagon to the back and ferrying passengers around town at low cost. The joke builds from there because Timmy's service, which he calls Handy Car, immediately starts disrupting every established form of transportation in the area. Taxi drivers lose business, car dealerships lose sales, and eventually the electric vehicle industry starts to feel threatened too, which is the moment Elon Musk walks into the story. Before getting to Musk specifically, it is worth sitting with the actual target of the episode for a moment, because the ride-sharing joke in Handy Car was not simply a joke about Uber and Lyft being popular. In 2014, the fight over ride-sharing was genuinely heated. Traditional taxi drivers had organized serious protests in multiple American cities. Regulatory battles were playing out in state legislatures across the country, with established industry groups arguing that services like Uber were operating outside the rules everyone else had to follow, and ride-sharing companies arguing that the old rules were protectionist structures designed to keep new competitors out rather than to protect passengers. The episode captures this tension almost exactly, with the taxi drivers in South Park responding to Handy Car not by improving their own service, but by demanding the government shut the whole thing down, treating the existence of a better competitor as something requiring regulatory protection rather than actual change. Parker and Stone had been watching this same argument play out in real newspapers for months, and they turned it into a subplot that runs underneath the episode without ever quite becoming the focus. What the episode is actually most interested in is something slightly different, which is the specific atmosphere of the tech industry in that particular period, and the way that atmosphere had started to generate its own set of personalities and symbols. Elon Musk in 2014 was not yet the enormous cultural presence he would later become. He was at that point primarily known as the CEO of Tesla Motors and the founder of SpaceX, two companies that carried a specific kind of cultural weight that had everything to do with ambition and very little to do with controversy. The Tesla brand in 2014 was genuinely exciting to a certain part of the American public. Electric cars had existed before, but they had mostly been small, slow, and unglamorous. Tesla had changed that by producing something that felt like a statement, a car that said something about the person driving it and the future they believed in. Musk himself had been photographed enough, quoted enough, and profiled enough in magazines that he had begun to acquire the particular status of someone who feels like a figure from the future accidentally dropped into the present. This is the version of Musk that South Park brought into Handy Car, and the portrait is not unkind. The episode depicts him as genuinely excited about his products, genuinely competitive, and genuinely frustrated when the audience at one of his Tesla reveal events turns out to be far more interested in Timmy's Handy Car than in anything Musk has to show them. He is drawn as a man whose biggest problem in this particular story is that someone else has built something more interesting than the thing he just unveiled, and his response to that problem is characteristically Musk. He does not quietly accept being outcompeted. He immediately starts looking for ways to win. The solution Musk lands on in the episode is a race, a full revival of the old Hanna-Barbera animated series Wacky Races, brought back to life with Musk's Tesla D competing against Timmy's Handy car, and a wide field of other vehicles including lift cars, zip cars, taxi cabs, a Hummer, a Japanese self-driving car, and the original Wacky Races characters Dick Dastardly and Muttley. This sequence is the part of the episode most people remember, and it is genuinely inventive in a way not all South Park episodes managed to be. The production team had clearly done serious homework on the original cartoon, capturing the specific visual language of the 1968 series in a way that would register clearly to anyone who had grown up watching Saturday morning television, while also working perfectly well as action comedy for viewers who had never seen a single frame of the original. Musk's Tesla D in this sequence is given technology that parodies a specific gadget from the original Wacky Races show, making his car one of the most fully realized vehicles in the race. He is not a simple background presence. He is a genuine competitor, driving hard, trying to win, and using all the capabilities of his vehicle to stay ahead of the field. The race becomes chaotic in the way Wacky Races always did, with various attempts at sabotage and an escalating series of increasingly absurd complications, and eventually Timmy's Handy car wins, not through any particular trick, but simply by being the vehicle that holds together longest and gets the passenger across the finish line first. The outcome is where the episode does something that matters more than it might appear at first glance. Musk does not respond to losing the race by becoming angry or threatening or litigious. Instead, he buys the rights to the entire Handy car service from Timmy for the sum of $2.3 billion. This single detail says more about the episode's actual view of Musk than anything else in the 22 minutes, because it is a genuinely respectful joke. It does not mock him for losing. It does not treat his defeat as humiliation. It treats him as someone whose immediate response to encountering something better than what he has is to acquire it, which is both accurate to how Musk actually operated in the business world at that point, and entirely in keeping with the version of him the episode had been building across the previous 20 minutes. He is shown as someone who competes hard, loses fairly, and then adapts intelligently. For a show that had spent years treating celebrity as inherently worthy of mockery, this was a notably generous portrait. What happened after the episode aired matters just as much as what was inside it. Musk watched it. He responded publicly. On the platform that would later become the center of an entirely different chapter of this story, he wrote that seeing himself on South Park was deeply strange, and then immediately referenced one of the show's earliest and most beloved bits, Brian Boitano, showing in a single post that he had not simply stumbled across the episode, but was in fact a genuine and longtime fan of the show. He did not reach out through a publicist. He did not issue a statement. He simply wrote about it the way a fan would, with specific reference to something that only a person who had actually watched the show carefully would know to mention. The post made clear he had been watching South Park for years before the show ever gave him a character of his own. This reaction landed very differently inside the South Park world than most celebrity reactions ever did. The usual pattern when a real person appeared in the show was one of two things. Either the person in question ignored the whole thing and hoped it would pass, or they expressed some form of displeasure and generated a secondary news story about how much they disliked being mocked. Musk did neither. He came back with something that functioned almost like a compliment from one fan to another, acknowledging the episode without defensiveness and demonstrating real familiarity with the show's history in the process. This is not a small thing when you understand how Parker and Stone actually respond to the world. The show's entire philosophy is built around equal treatment, around the refusal to give any person or institution permanent protection from being examined and laughed at. A celebrity who laughs along, who treats being lampooned as an honor rather than an insult, becomes something unusual inside that philosophy. They become someone the show has something resembling actual respect for. The specific value of being seen by South Park and not flinching should not be underestimated in understanding how the relationship between Musk and Parker and Stone developed from this point. For most public figures, the experience of being placed inside a South Park episode and depicted with even mild criticism creates an immediate instinct toward distance or complaint. The show's reputation for being relentless means that many people who could easily laugh at a gentle joke about their own habits or businesses choose instead to say nothing and avoid any gesture that might invite a follow-up. Musk did the opposite. He acknowledged the joke publicly and demonstrated that he had been paying attention to the show long before it ever included him. That particular combination, willingness to be seen and genuine familiarity with what the show actually is, opened a door that very few people in public life have ever walked through with the South Park creators. There is also something worth examining in what the episode chose to include and what it left out. By 2014, Musk already had a public record complicated enough for South Park to have worked with if the writers had wanted to be genuinely pointed. The Tesla company had faced serious questions about its finances. SpaceX was still an experimental program with a mixed record of successes and failures. Musk himself had made enough public statements and predictions grand enough to be questioned. None of this made it into HandyCar. The episode chose to play him almost entirely as a competent and energetic businessman who simply got outcompeted by a wheelchair-bound kid with a wagon, which is a joke about disruption rather than a joke about any specific failing. A more aggressive version of this episode could have taken real shots, and the writers chose not to. That choice, whether conscious or not, reflected something about how Parker and Stone saw Musk at that point in time, as a legitimate figure in the tech world who happened to be in the middle of a cultural moment worth examining, rather than as a target whose specific flaws deserved a sustained attack. The ride-sharing economy the episode was primarily satirizing had something important in common with Musk's broader public image in that period. Both were built around the idea that someone smart enough and fast enough to move before the existing rules caught up with them could reshape entire industries almost overnight. Timmy's HandyCar operates on exactly that logic, offering something better than what existed before, and scaling rapidly simply because it works and is cheaper. The taxi industry's response, demanding government protection rather than improving the service, becomes the actual subject of the satire, with the disruptor himself treated as basically sympathetic by comparison. This framing placed Musk on the right side of the story by association, since his Tesla represented a different, but structurally similar kind of disruption to the traditional automotive industry. The episode is not really defending Musk specifically. It is defending the general category of people who build things that work better than the old things, and Musk happened to be one of the most visible members of that category in the fall of 2014. This alignment between Musk's public image at the time and the episode's basic sympathies is part of what made the reaction on both sides so unusually warm. South Park rarely produces episodes that feel friendly toward the people they depict. Most of the show's portraits of real people are built around exposing something about how that person, or what they represent, actually works underneath the surface, using the compressed and exaggerated format of a 22-minute cartoon to make a point that would be harder to land in any other form. HandyCar does do this to Musk to a small degree, treating his competitive instincts and his comfort with spending enormous sums of money as things the episode can play with and get laughs from. But the overall tone is something closer to affectionate ribbing than sustained critique, and Musk's own public response confirmed that he recognized it as such and appreciated rather than resented the treatment. What the episode started, and what the reaction on both sides reinforced, was the foundation of something genuinely unusual in the history of South Park and the many public figures it had touched over the years. A powerful person had been included in an episode, depicted with recognizable accuracy, seen the result, and come away from the experience not as an enemy or a disappointed target, but as something closer to a satisfied viewer. That kind of outcome does not happen often. Most of the time, the distance between what South Park puts on screen and how the subject of that depiction receives it is enormous, filled with lawyers or publicists or simply the ordinary human discomfort of being examined by a camera you did not invite into your life. With Musk in 2014, that distance collapsed almost completely, and what was left in its place was the beginning of something much stranger and more personal than the usual celebrity show dynamic. It was the beginning of an actual connection between the people behind South Park and one of the most consequential public figures of the following decade. And that connection, warm and genuinely mutual as it was, is the thing that makes everything that came after it so much more worth paying attention to than a simple story about a show mocking a rich person would ever be. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. HandyCar was just the opening move, and both sides seemed to enjoy it. But a show built on the promise of no permanent protection had only just begun with Elon Musk. 2 years later, the relationship stepped into genuinely new territory, when Musk did something almost no one in his position had ever done before on South Park. He answered the phone. Section 2, The Voice in the Room, Season 20 and the Guest Nobody Expected. Something happened between the broadcast of HandyCar in October 2014 and the beginning of South Park's 20th season in September 2016 that almost never happens in the world where celebrity and satire intersect. The person who had been depicted in the show became a genuine acquaintance of the people who made it, not a business contact, not a mutual connection through the entertainment industry. An actual person Trey Parker spent real time with outside of any professional context, doing something as ordinary and unhurried as sitting around a table playing a role-playing game. At the 2016 San Diego Comic-Con panel for Season 20, Parker mentioned it casually, the way someone brings up a recent weekend plan rather than a notable event. He said that about 2 months earlier, he had played Dungeons & Dragons with Elon Musk, and that it had been genuinely fun. This was not a promotional item. It was not a planned talking point dropped into the interview to generate headlines. It landed as exactly what it appeared to be, an offhand detail from someone's actual social life. The kind of thing that slips out because the person saying it has already processed it as ordinary rather than remarkable. For anyone paying close attention to the South Park universe and who existed inside it, the detail was anything but ordinary. The short list of celebrities who had voiced themselves on South Park before 2016 includes Sir Elton John and Robert Smith of The Cure, names that belong to a very specific category of public figures the show's creators clearly held in genuine personal regard. The choice to invite someone to voice their own character in South Park rather than having Parker or Stone or another cast member do a rough approximation of the voice represents a specific kind of trust running in both directions. The show trusts that the person understands what they are walking into and will not try to soften or redirect how they are being used inside the story. And the person trusts that the show will use their voice to make something worth making, rather than simply using the real voice as a novelty that embarrasses its owner. That mutual trust is rare. Most public figures who appear in South Park have no voice in how they are depicted, literally or otherwise. The ones invited to provide their own voice are a different category entirely. Musk's appearance was confirmed in the show's 20th season, which is also the season most deeply associated with internet trolling, the 2016 presidential election, and a sustained examination of what happens to online culture when bad faith behavior scales up fast enough to reshape public conversation. The main storyline of Season 20 follows Gerald Broflovsky, the father of Kyle, as a secret internet troll and traces the consequences of that secret through a storyline involving a Danish surveillance program called Troll Trace that threatens to expose the private online histories of everyone on Earth. Running parallel to this main plot is a subplot involving Cartman and his girlfriend Heidi Turner, who become convinced that the only reasonable response to the chaos unfolding around them is to leave the planet entirely and start over on Mars. This is where Musk enters the season's story. Cartman and Heidi, along with Butters, travel to SpaceX believing that Musk will simply have a Mars rocket ready to take them away from everything happening on Earth. What they find instead is a tour of the facility led by Musk himself, during which he explains patiently that a Mars rocket is not something that exists yet, that it is still several years away at minimum, and that the timeline for getting to Mars is not driven by how urgently someone wants to leave the planet, but by the actual state of rocket technology, and the enormous complexity of what a real Mars mission would require. The gap between what Cartman expected and what Musk tells him is played entirely for comedy, but the comedy is not at Musk's expense. He is the one being reasonable. Cartman is the one whose assumptions about what a private space company could deliver on demand turn out to be wildly disconnected from reality. There is something specific about this framing worth paying attention to, because it represents a choice. When South Park places a real person inside a storyline, the show controls how that person's position in the story maps onto the overall argument being made. By casting Musk as the adult in the room who has to explain to a 9-year-old that ambition and urgency are not the same thing as capability and timelines, the episode is treating him as a credible authority rather than a figure of mockery. Cartman's fantasy of simply showing up and boarding a spacecraft is the thing being punctured. Musk's actual program, with all its complexity and long timelines, is treated as the real and legitimate thing that fantasy has to contend with. The voice performance Musk delivered across 3 episodes of Season 20 is understated in a way that works well inside the show's format. South Park's vocal style for real public figures tends toward broad imitation, with the show's own performers doing exaggerated versions of recognizable voices that amplifies certain qualities for comic effect. Having the actual person provide their own voice creates a different kind of texture inside the episode. Musk's delivery is calm and somewhat flat, which fits the role he is playing within the story. He is not the dramatic center of any scene. He is the person the dramatic center of the scene has come to see, and he consistently returns the story to practical reality when the characters around him start spiraling into fantasy or panic. This restraint turns out to be exactly right for what the episodes need from him, since a more theatrical performance would have pulled attention away from the actual comedy happening around him. Across the 3 season 20 episodes, Musk's character appears at key moments in the SpaceX subplot without ever dominating the storyline. The episodes are members only, not funny, and the end of serialization as we know it. In Members Only, he leads the tour and delivers the first explanation that Mars is not immediately available. In Not Funny, he remains a background presence as Heidi works at SpaceX, attempting to solve the math required to actually get a rocket to Mars, with Musk periodically expressing skepticism that this is going to work. In the end of serialization as we know it, which is the season finale, SpaceX is ultimately destroyed in the climax of the Troll Trace storyline, and Cartman's last line to Musk is the suggestion that he simply go back to making electric cars, a line that carries a specific sting because by this point in the season, the audience has watched the SpaceX facility become the center of so much hope and chaos before being lost entirely. The line is not cruel, it is the sound of a dream being quietly deflated at the moment when something larger and more urgent takes priority. One scene in particular from the season 20 storyline captures the specific comedic dynamic that makes Musk's appearance across these episodes work as well as it does. In Not Funny, Cartman is trying to convince Musk that Heidi is smart enough to solve the problems preventing a Mars launch, repeatedly insisting that she is smart and funny, which was the specific line Cartman had been using throughout the season to justify staying in a relationship that was clearly becoming something more controlling than genuine. Musk responds that he has not heard Heidi say anything funny, and Cartman tells him that the problem is a mental block that would not let Musk see what is right in front of him. This exchange works on 2 levels simultaneously. On the surface, it is about whether one specific girl can solve a rocket science problem. Underneath, it is about Cartman's increasingly desperate need for everyone around him to validate his relationship rather than examine it honestly. Musk's mild skepticism in this moment, completely reasonable from his character's perspective, serves as an inadvertent mirror for everything Cartman is refusing to see about his own situation. The scene is funny partly because of how calm Musk remains while Cartman gets increasingly worked up around him. The commentary Parker and Stone recorded for season 20 added another layer to all of this. Parker mentioned on the recording that he and Musk had been playing board games together, including Dungeons and Dragons, expanding slightly on the detail he had mentioned at Comic-Con. He spoke about it with the particular casualness that comes from having already gotten used to something unusual, the tone of someone who had thought about mentioning it and decided it was simply part of the background of making this particular season. The specificity of which game they were playing also matters in a small but telling way. Dungeons and Dragons is not a celebrity-studded activity. It is the kind of game that takes several hours, requires genuine engagement with a shared fictional world, and tends to reveal something about how a person thinks under low-stakes conditions. Trey Parker, knowing that Musk immediately wanted to play a human paladin without hesitation and before the game had even started, is the kind of detail that suggests the 2 men had spent enough time together for Parker to have noticed and remembered something specific about how Musk approached the game. The Saturday Night Live connection adds another small piece to this picture. After Musk hosted Saturday Night Live in May of 2021, he held a party afterward and Matt Stone attended it. This is not the kind of event someone attends out of professional obligation. Hosting Saturday Night Live and then throwing a party for people from that world is a social occasion, not a meeting. Stone being present there, several years after the season 20 collaboration, suggests that whatever connection had formed between Musk and the South Park creators had not been simply a one-off professional interaction that faded after the voiceover sessions were finished. It had continued in the quiet background way that actual friendships tend to continue, through occasional contact rather than sustained closeness. All of this matters because of what it means for the larger story this video is tracing. South Park has spent nearly 3 decades building its identity around the idea that nobody is permanently off limits. The show has gone after religious institutions willing to pursue real legal action. It has mocked sitting presidents and major celebrities who had the financial resources to fight back. It has criticized governments powerful enough to simply erase the show from their own internet. The show's stated philosophy, which Parker and Stone have repeated in interviews across the entire run, is that equal treatment is the only honest position a piece of satire can hold. Protection from mockery should not be available for purchase, or earned through fame, or granted because someone belongs to a group considered too sensitive to criticize. The only way to hold that position without compromising it is to actually apply it, even when applying it is personally uncomfortable. The existence of a genuine friendship between the people who make South Park and the person the show would eventually turn its attention toward in a much sharper way creates a specific kind of tension that most celebrity satire stories never have to deal with. Most of the time, the distance between South Park and its targets is enormous and completely uncomplicated. Tom Cruise did not know Trey Parker personally before Trapped in the Closet aired. Rob Reiner did not play board games with Matt Stone before Butt Out made him a punchline. The standard relationship between the show and the people it examines is one of total asymmetry, with the show holding all the creative control and the target holding essentially none of it. The Musk situation introduced something the show almost never had to navigate, which is what happens to its fundamental philosophy when the target is someone the creators actually like. At the time of season 20, that tension did not really exist yet in any meaningful form. The portrait of Musk across those 3 episodes is gentle enough, even fond enough, that voicing himself could not have felt like anything other than an enjoyable creative exercise. He was playing a version of himself doing something real and ambitious, set against a backdrop of chaos and absurdity that had nothing to do with criticizing anything about him specifically. The show was using his actual program, his actual personality, and his actual voice to add texture to a story that happened to be set partly in the building where he worked. That is a fundamentally different experience from watching a show build an episode designed to examine your specific flaws or expose something you would rather keep private. What Musk stepped into when he agreed to voice himself in season 20 was, in the context of 2016, about as close to an uncomplicated invitation as South Park ever extends to anyone. He was asked to lend his voice to a storyline that treated him as a legitimate and serious figure whose Mars ambitions were worth taking seriously, even inside a story full of internet trolls, a Danish surveillance conspiracy, and Cartman's relationship problems. He said yes, he showed up, and by all available evidence, he considered it a positive experience. The commentary exists, the Comic-Con mention exists, the SNL party connection exists. None of this suggests someone who felt used or misled by the collaboration. But South Park's philosophy, the one Parker and Stone have defended across every controversy in the show's history, does not actually include an exception for people the creators are personally fond of. The equal opportunity principle, stated again and again across the show's run, is not something that contains a clause allowing the list of protected targets to expand as the creator's personal social circle grows. The show has always been willing to go after powerful figures, regardless of how those figures had previously treated the show or its creators. That willingness is, in fact, what gives the philosophy any meaning at all. An equal opportunity that stops at the edges of the creator's actual relationships is not really equal opportunity. It is just a list of everyone the creators happen to dislike, dressed up in philosophical language. The years between season 20 and what would eventually happen in season 27 are the years in which Musk's own public identity changed more dramatically than perhaps any other figure in American public life. The person who sat across from Trey Parker playing Dungeons and Dragons in 2016 and the person South Park was making ketamine jokes about in 2025 share a name and a face and a set of companies. Almost everything else about how the world understood that person and how that person apparently understood the world had shifted in ways that would have been very difficult to predict from the vantage point of a SpaceX conference room in the fall of 2016, when a calm man in a gray suit patiently explained to an animated 9-year-old that Mars was not ready yet and probably would not be for quite some time. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The version of Musk that appeared in season 20 was a man the show treated as a credible builder of real things, working on timelines that required patience rather than urgency. What came next in his public life required neither patience nor a long timeline. Section 3. Screw you guys. The Twitter purchase and the first signal. Purchasing a social media platform that hundreds of millions of people use every day is not a quiet act. buying it for roughly $44 billion after months of public back and forth about whether the deal would happen at all, then immediately laying off a significant portion of the workforce within days of the purchase being finalized, is even less quiet. When Elon Musk officially completed his acquisition of Twitter on October 30th, 2022, the event generated the kind of sustained media coverage that tends to follow something genuinely unprecedented. A single individual, using his own money, had taken control of one of the central arteries of global public conversation. The rules governing what could and could not be said on the service would be set by him. The direction the platform moved would reflect his decisions and his instincts, whatever those turned out to be once the actual work of running a platform that size landed on a single desk. The reaction across the internet was enormous and extraordinarily mixed. Some users were enthusiastic, believing Musk's stated commitment to free speech principles would loosen restrictions they felt had been unfairly applied to certain kinds of content and certain voices. Others were alarmed, worried that loosening those restrictions would allow harmful content to spread more freely than before. A large number of users simply expressed how the whole situation felt through the cultural shorthand that social media runs on, by posting references to things from popular culture that captured the mood without requiring a long explanation. The platform during those first weeks of Musk's ownership was full of people announcing departures, real or theatrical, expressing in various ways what it felt like to be inside a familiar space that had suddenly become uncertain. South Park's official account posted something during this period that was simple enough to read in 2 seconds and sharp enough to stick in the memory of anyone who caught it. The post contained Eric Cartman's single most recognizable line from across the show's entire run, used so consistently throughout its history that it had become a kind of unofficial catchphrase for the character and the show simultaneously. The line was, "Screw you guys, I'm going home." No explanation was offered, no context was provided. The line stood alone, posted on the platform Musk had just finished buying, by the official account of a show whose creator had played Dungeons & Dragons with him less than a decade earlier. The joke worked the way the best South Park jokes always work, by doing more than one thing at the same time. On the surface, it was a well-timed character quote deployed to match a cultural moment. Cartman says some version of this line whenever a situation becomes intolerable, and he decides withdrawal is more satisfying than continued participation, which mapped cleanly onto the behavior of users announcing they were leaving the platform in the wake of the ownership change. As reactive content, the post required almost no interpretation, but the additional layer sitting underneath the surface joke was the one people actually talked about. South Park posted this specific line on this specific platform at this specific moment, and the account doing the posting belonged to the same show whose creator had a documented personal friendship with the man who had just bought the platform. The line Cartman delivers when he decides to leave is built around rejection and frustration, the emotional response of someone who has decided that the space they are in no longer belongs to them in any meaningful way. Posting it on a platform that had just changed hands with no additional commentary allowed the joke to function simultaneously as a winking acknowledgement of the mass exodus energy surrounding the acquisition and as a quieter observation about what it feels like when something familiar becomes unrecognizable under new ownership. Whether that second layer was intentional or simply a fortunate resonance the team running the account allowed to exist is impossible to know from outside the writer's room. South Park's social media presence has always been managed with a certain economy of words, letting the material speak rather than adding lengthy explanations of what a post means. What can be said with certainty is that the post landed, circulated widely, and that people writing about it made the connection between the show, its creator's friendship with Musk, and the specific cultural moment the quote was being deployed into. A piece of reporting from around that time noted that Musk had called himself a longtime fan after his season 18 appearance, and then observed that the Cartman quote was now sitting on his own newly purchased platform, posted there by the show he had expressed such fondness for. The juxtaposition carried its own meaning without requiring anyone to spell it out. This moment represents a genuinely unusual kind of move in the world of celebrity and satire. Most of the time, when South Park wants to address something a public figure has done, it builds a full episode around it. A single social media post is an entirely different instrument, too short and too contextually dependent to carry that kind of argument. What it can do is something different. It can mark a moment. It can signal, without fully committing, that the people behind the show have noticed what is happening and formed an opinion they are willing to express in the compressed compressed, oblique language of a well-chosen character quote. The Cartman post did exactly that. It did not constitute a judgment. It registered a mood. The platform itself becoming central to this story is one of those details that would feel too neat if it appeared in fiction rather than actual events. The show that had befriended Musk was now making its first small gestures of commentary about him on a platform he personally owned. The specific location of the joke became part of the joke itself. South Park was using Musk's own newly purchased infrastructure to deliver a line about leaving, which is either a coincidence or a piece of extremely dry wit, and given how Parker and Stone approached these things, the second explanation seems at least as plausible as the first. Season 26, which aired across 6 episodes from February to late March of 2023, contained a reference to Musk that marked a specific and notable shift from anything the show had done with him before. Musk appeared, but was voiced by someone other than himself, in contrast to his Season 20 appearances where he had provided his own voice. This single production detail carries more information than it might initially appear to. When someone voices themselves on South Park, as Musk had done across 3 Season 20 episodes, that participation implies active cooperation with the show and its creative process. When a show instead has one of its own performers voice a version of a real person, it is operating without that cooperation, the same way the show handles the vast majority of real public figures it depicts across its run. The shift from self-voiced to show-voiced is not automatically a sign of hostility. What it does indicate is that the specific kind of creative collaboration defining the Season 20 appearances was not being repeated, and that whatever connection existed between Musk and the people making the show had not translated into another invitation to record lines for a new set of episodes. This is the point in the timeline where the friendship begins to show its first signs of being tested by the show's fundamental creative principles, rather than reinforced by them. There is a small detail from 2023 that sits quietly alongside the Season 26 reference and adds a specific texture to this period. In a CNBC interview that year discussing the subscription model he was building for the X platform, Musk quoted South Park directly. He noted that free speech is not free and costs a little bit, referencing it in the show's specific language to make a point about why charging for platform features made sense as a policy. The quote comes from Parker and Stone's 2004 film Team America: World Police, where the point about freedom having a cost is delivered in a satirical context designed to mock a certain kind of aggressive patriotism rather than endorse it. Using that line in a straightforward argument about subscription pricing strips the satirical context entirely, leaving only the surface statement without any of the irony the writers had built into it. This is worth pausing on. By 2023, Musk was still referencing the show in public. He was still treating it as cultural shorthand familiar enough to deploy in a business context. He was still, by his own accounting, a fan. But his relationship with the material had apparently not updated in ways that would allow him to notice that quoting Team America's freedom line to justify a Twitter subscription fee was using satire as a straight argument, which is precisely the kind of move South Park had spent years building episodes to examine in other public figures. The distance between Musk's continued fondness for the show and the show's increasingly complicated relationship with what he represented had not yet produced anything sharp enough to generate sustained public conversation by the close of 2023. The Season 26 reference existed, the Cartman post existed, neither had the weight of a full episode built around him. They were signals, read by people paying close attention, suggesting that the show's creative orientation toward Musk was no longer simply warm. What was building during this period, quietly and in parallel with the show's ongoing attention, was the full set of conditions required for a more sustained and direct form of satirical engagement. Musk's transformation from a tech entrepreneur known primarily for electric cars and rocket ships into a major political actor with direct access to the most powerful office in the United States had changed the calculus of what it meant to put him inside a South Park episode. In 2014, including him in HandyCar meant adding a recognizable figure from the world of technology to a story about disruption. By the end of 2023, including him meant engaging with a person whose public identity had expanded to touch nearly every major controversy running through American political and cultural life simultaneously. The equal opportunity philosophy does not operate on a sliding scale, where the more powerful someone becomes, the more protection they receive from examination. Parker and Stone have said repeatedly across their careers that the opposite is closer to true. Taboos attract them. Power that seems too large or too connected to challenge draws their attention precisely because of that quality. The pattern running through the show's sharpest work is that the size of the risk involved in doing something is often the most reliable signal that the thing is worth worth doing. By the close of 2023, the conditions for a much sharper engagement with Musk had been assembling quietly for several years. The friendship had not disappeared, but the show it existed alongside was already watching carefully, and the distance between watching carefully and saying something directly had been closing for long enough that the eventual arrival of a more pointed satirical move was not a surprise to anyone who had been paying attention to the sequence of small signals laid down across the years. Between a Dungeons & Dragons game in 2016 and a character quote posted on a newly purchased platform in 2022. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The signals had been accumulating quietly for years, each one small enough on its own to be explained away, but clear enough in sequence to suggest a direction. What came next was not a signal, it was a full episode, a character doing ketamine nasal spray on a platform Musk owned, and a meme posted on that same platform the following day, to make absolutely certain nobody missed the point. Section 4. Tecrity. The ketamine arc and the indirect attack. Randy Marsh has always been the character South Park uses when it wants to say something about a particular kind of adult failure. Not the failure of someone who never tried, but the failure of someone who tried repeatedly with enormous confidence in entirely the wrong direction. Randy is the show's designated vessel for a specific kind of masculine self-delusion, the man who consistently mistakes his own enthusiasm for expertise and his own certainty for evidence. He has been a geologist, a celebrity singer, a marijuana farmer, and a sushi chef, among many other things, and across every one of those phases, the joke is always essentially the same. Randy believes, fully and without hesitation, that whatever he is currently doing represents the most important and most visionary version of himself, and the people around him, primarily his family, are left to absorb the consequences of that belief while he chases the next version of it. By season 27, which premiered on Comedy Central on July 23, 2025, the Tegrity Farms era of Randy's life had already stretched across several seasons. The marijuana farm he had moved his family to in season 22 had been the central joke of his character arc for years, built around the premise that Randy had convinced himself growing weed in rural Colorado was a noble and principled stand, rather than simply a middle-aged man's enthusiastic response to legalization. By 2025, the farm was in serious trouble. Immigration enforcement raids had removed most of the workforce, leaving Randy and his sole remaining employee, the character Towley, unable to operate at anything close to the scale the business needed to survive. The show had arrived at the point where the Tegrity Farms joke required a new direction, and the direction it chose was one of the most pointed pieces of indirect satire the show had produced in years. The episode that crystallized this new direction is called Sycophancy, and it aired on August 20th, 2025. The plot begins with Randy confronting the reality that the farm cannot continue operating as it has been. His wife Sharon tells him plainly that while the family had always supported him, the marijuana farm was his dream rather than theirs, and that she is not sure how much longer she can pretend otherwise. Randy's response to this pressure is to turn to ChatGPT for advice, consulting the artificial intelligence system the way someone might consult a therapist or a trusted business advisor. The joke in this sequence is that ChatGPT, as the episode depicts it, is almost entirely sycophantic, responding to every one of Randy's ideas with enthusiasm and validation, regardless of whether those ideas have any practical value. Sharon watches this unfold with visible frustration, pointing out that the AI is simply telling Randy what he wants to hear, rather than offering anything genuinely useful. Randy, predictably, prefers the AI's version of reality to his wife's. The solution ChatGPT proposes is for Randy to rebrand Tegrity Farms entirely. Rather than remaining a marijuana farm, the business should become a technology company. This rebranding produces the episode's central joke, which is the creation of a new enterprise called Tecrity, described within the episode as an AI-powered marijuana platform for global solutions. The phrase itself is the joke, capturing with uncomfortable accuracy the specific kind of language real technology companies use to describe ordinary activities, dressed up in the vocabulary of disruption and scale. Marijuana farming is an entirely concrete and physical activity. Describing it as an AI-powered platform for global solutions adds no real content to that description. It simply makes the whole thing sound more important than it is, which is precisely the function that kind of language serves in actual tech industry communications. Randy's transformation into into a tech executive figure does not stop at rebranding the company name. The episode uses his conversion to the tech world as an opportunity to build toward its most direct and most discussed piece of satirical commentary, which arrives through his adoption of ketamine as a professional tool. ChatGPT, continuing its role as an enthusiastic validator of every bad idea Randy generates, has apparently advised him that microdosing ketamine is a standard practice among successful technology executives, a way of expanding the mind and accessing creative states not available through ordinary consciousness. Randy becomes convinced by this, acquires a ketamine nasal spray, and begins using it as part of his new identity as a tech entrepreneur, treating the drug not as a recreational substance, but as a legitimate component of his professional toolkit, the same way a serious executive might treat a particular productivity method or a business philosophy. The specific image the episode builds around this, Randy with a ketamine nasal spray, presenting himself as a visionary in the mold of Silicon Valley's most recognizable figures, was clear enough in its reference that the show's own social media account removed any remaining ambiguity the following day. The official South Park account on X, the platform Elon Musk had purchased and rebranded from Twitter, posted a meme showing Randy Marsh holding the ketamine nasal spray with the text, "Just like any tech company, we are expanding our minds by microdosing ketamine." The caption accompanying the meme read, "Randy knows the real secret to becoming a tech mogul. Musk was not named. He did not need to be." The combination of the episode's content and the meme's framing, posted on a platform he owned, aimed at an audience that had been following the public conversation about his drug use for well over a year, made the target obvious to anyone paying even minimal attention. The background to why ketamine specifically carried so much satirical weight by the time Sycophancy aired requires understanding the timeline of public reporting about Musk's drug use. In 2024, Musk had spoken openly about his ketamine use in an interview with journalist Don Lemon, describing a prescription he held from a licensed physician and explaining that he used a small amount every other week or so to address what he described as a negative chemical state in his brain, something resembling depression not connected to any specific negative news. He framed the use as medical and modest, supervised and controlled, taken for a legitimate mental health purpose rather than recreationally. This admission generated significant coverage, but was largely treated at the time as a somewhat unusual disclosure rather than a scandal, partly because the framing Musk offered was clinical, and partly because the amounts he described seemed consistent with legitimate therapeutic use. The New York Times then published a much more extensive and far more damaging report in May of 2025, based on interviews with a dozen people who had known or worked with Musk, as well as private text messages, legal documents, and photographic evidence. The Times report describes drug use on a scale dramatically larger than anything Musk had publicly acknowledged. According to the report, Musk had told people during the 2024 presidential campaign trail that he was using ketamine so frequently that it was causing bladder issues, which medical sources identified as a common consequence of chronic heavy use rather than the modest therapeutic doses he had described to Don Lemon. The report also alleged regular use of ecstasy and psychedelic mushrooms and described a daily medication box Musk traveled with, containing roughly 20 pills, some carrying markings consistent with Adderall. Musk disputed the reporting directly and publicly, accusing the Times of lying, while the paper defended its sourcing and stood by its reporting. The dispute between Musk's denial and the Times reporting remained publicly unresolved. Sycophancy aired in August 2025, roughly 3 months after the Times report had generated its own significant wave of coverage and public discussion. By that point, ketamine had become one of the most immediately recognizable shorthand references to Musk available in popular culture, sitting alongside his ownership of X and his role in the Department of Government Efficiency as the 3 details most likely to appear in any satirical treatment of his public persona. The episode's choice to build Randy's tech transformation specifically around ketamine use was therefore not simply a joke about drug culture inside Silicon Valley in general. It was a joke with a clear and specific reference point, positioned at exactly the moment when that reference would be most immediately legible to the largest possible audience. The choice to deliver this satire through Randy, rather than through a direct depiction of Musk himself, is the production decision that defines the episode's particular approach and separates it from the show's earlier treatments of Musk as a character. In Handy Car and across season 20, Musk Musk appeared as himself, named and depicted with at least a degree of direct engagement with who he actually was as a public figure. Sycophancy takes a different route. Randy's transformation into a ketamine-using tech bro is clearly modeled on a recognizable public figure, but that figure is never named and never appears directly on screen. The satire operates through resemblance and implication rather than direct portrayal, which is a meaningful distinction in terms of what the episode is willing to commit to publicly. This indirectness has been read in several different ways by people covering the episode. One reading is that Parker and Stone, aware of their previous personal connection to Musk, were choosing to make their point without making it entirely personal, allowing the critique to land through the character of Randy without turning it into a direct attack on someone who had been a genuine social acquaintance. Another reading is that the indirectness is itself a satirical choice, treating Musk as someone whose behavior has become generic enough to be captured through a character type rather than requiring specific individual portrayal. Under this reading, Randy does not need to be named Elon, because Randy doing ketamine nasal spray and rebranding a farm as an AI platform for global solutions already describes the category of person the episode is examining, of which Musk is simply the most visible current example. The social media meme posted the following day complicates the indirectness argument considerably, since posting on X itself with a caption explicitly naming the real secret to becoming a tech mogul, while Musk's ketamine use was the dominant context for anyone encountering that phrase, amounted to pointing directly at the thing the episode had technically left unnamed. This is a specific kind of satirical move, using the official episode to maintain a degree of plausible separation between the character and the target, then using the show's social media presence to collapse that separation entirely for anyone who might have missed it. The episode says Randy, the meme says you know who this is about. Together, they accomplish what neither does alone, which is to make a pointed and specific statement about a real public figure, while maintaining enough formal distance that the statement comes through a layer of character and implication rather than direct accusation. What makes the meme specifically significant beyond its content is where it was posted. Musk had purchased Twitter in 2022 and renamed it X. The platform was now his in the most direct sense possible. South Park's official account posting a meme on that platform aimed clearly at the person who owned it, while using Randy Marsh holding a ketamine nasal spray as the vehicle for the joke, produced a very specific kind of irony that would have been impossible to construct on any other platform. The show was delivering a pointed joke about the platform's owner on the platform's owner's own infrastructure, which is a slightly more elaborate and more committed version of the Cartman post from 2022, when the line about leaving had been deployed on the same platform in the immediate aftermath of the acquisition. The reaction to Sycophancy and the accompanying meme was substantial. Coverage appeared across entertainment outlets, technology publications, and general news sources, largely unified around the observation that South Park had taken its sharpest swipe yet at Musk, even while stopping just short of naming him directly in the episode itself. The question several outlets posed, including one piece published by Cracked that specifically referenced the Dungeons & Dragons history, was whether the personal friendship between Parker and Musk had survived the episode intact, or whether the show's willingness to deploy Randy as a ketamine-snorting tech bro aimed clearly at Musk's most publicly discussed habit represented the point at which that friendship had been formally, if quietly, set aside in service of the show's creative priorities. That question remains genuinely open. Musk did not publicly respond to the episode or the meme in the days following their release, at least not in any way that generated significant coverage. The absence of a response is itself a kind of data point, though what it actually means is difficult to determine from outside both parties' private lives. A person who finds a joke funny and a person who finds a joke painful can both choose silence as their response for entirely different reasons, and there is no reliable way from the outside to determine which of those responses is operating in any given case. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The episode said Randy. The meme said you know exactly who this is. But neither the episode nor the meme addressed the largest shift in Musk's public life directly, the thing that had changed everything about his cultural position and made him the most discussed figure in American life by the time season 27 went into production. Section 5. The Doge Question. Equal opportunity in the room where power lives. The Department of Government Efficiency was not a government department in the conventional sense. It had no statutory authority, no confirmed budget, and no formal place in the organizational chart of the federal government as established by law. What it had was Elon Musk, an enormous amount of public attention, and direct access to the kind of decisions that normally require years of bureaucratic process and congressional oversight before they can be implemented. From January 2025 onward, Doge became one of the most discussed and most controversial elements of the second Trump administration, generating sustained coverage across every major news organization in the country and becoming, within a matter of weeks, one of the defining features of how the administration presented itself to the public. Musk was its most visible figure, appearing at events, posting constantly on X, and conducting himself in a way that made the line between his role as a private citizen and his role as a government-adjacent actor genuinely difficult to locate with any precision. For South Park, an entity that had spent nearly 3 decades building its identity around the equal treatment of powerful figures across the entire political spectrum, the existence of Doge and Musk's role within it created a specific kind of creative question that the show had not quite faced in this exact form before. The question was not simply whether to mock Musk, since the Techrity episode and the meme had already answered that question in the affirmative. The more complicated question was how to handle the broader political environment that Musk now occupied, given that the show's creators had spent years insisting they were not partisan, not aligned with either major political movement in the United States, and genuinely committed to treating extremism wherever they found it, rather than selectively targeting one side while leaving the other alone. This question arrived at the same time as season 27, which premiered on July 23, 2025, and which Parker and Stone had been preparing across a period when the American political landscape had become, by their own description, impossible to look away from. In September 2024, they had spoken to Vanity Fair and to The Hollywood Reporter about why they were planning to skip the election cycle entirely, reasoning that they had already said everything they could say about Trump across previous seasons and did not want to produce work that felt repetitive or obligatory. The decision to wait to come back in 2025 rather than engaging with the 2024 election directly was framed as a creative judgment rather than a political one. They did not want to make the show they felt they were expected to make. They wanted to come back when they had something genuinely new to say. What they came back with in July 2025 was a season that became almost immediately one of the most talked about stretches of television the show had produced in years. The season 27 premiere, titled Sermon on the Mount, depicted Trump in ways that generated a sharp public rebuke from the White House the morning after it aired. A spokesperson for the administration described the show as hanging on by a thread with uninspired ideas in a desperate attempt for attention, which is the kind of institutional response that tends to have the opposite of its intended effect on a show that has always treated official disapproval as confirmation it is doing something worth doing. Parker said at San Diego Comic-Con days later, in response to a question about the White House reaction, simply, "We are terribly sorry." Stone added that there would be no more politics, none of that, and then grinned. The administration's reaction to the premiere did something specific to the trajectory of season 27 that Parker and Stone later described in interviews as unexpected in its scale. They had planned for Trump to appear in a single episode, not as the defining thread of the entire season. The White House pushback and the enormous viewership numbers that followed the premiere changed the calculus. Parker described the season as essentially being built in response to its own reception, with the creators watching the administration react and deciding, each time a new reaction arrived, that the reaction itself was worth exploring further. The season that followed depicted Trump in a sustained and graphic satirical portrait spanning multiple episodes, alongside other administration figures, including members of the cabinet and senior advisors, in material that drew record ratings while generating continuous controversy from the political figures being depicted. Musk sat inside all of this in a specific and somewhat complicated position. He had left his formal Doge role by the time the season aired, stepping back from his government-adjacent position in the spring of 2025, though the reporting around his departure suggested the separation was more complicated than a clean exit. He remained closely associated with the administration in public perception, had spent $290 million supporting Trump's 2024 campaign, according to reporting from multiple outlets, and continued to use X as a platform for political commentary. His departure from the formal Doge structure did not significantly reduce his presence in the public conversation about what the administration was doing and who was doing it. Season 27's treatment of Musk sat in an interesting position relative to its treatment of Trump and other administration figures. The season depicted Trump directly and extensively, building a sustained satirical portrait across multiple episodes that was pointed enough to draw an official response from the White House. Other figures connected to the administration were depicted directly as well, with enough specificity to generate their own separate responses from some of the people involved. Musk, by contrast, continued to be handled through the Randy Marsh proxy that Sycophants had established, present in the season's satirical landscape through association and implication, rather than direct individual portrayal. The ketamine thread that had been introduced in Sycophancy continued as part of Randy's arc, keeping the reference point alive without escalating it into the kind of direct, named engagement the other targets were receiving. This asymmetry is worth sitting with carefully, because it raises the equal opportunity question in its sharpest possible form. If the show was willing to depict Trump directly and graphically across an entire season, willing to put his cabinet members on screen by name and profession, willing to produce material pointed enough that the White House felt compelled to respond officially, then what does it mean that Musk, a figure whose connection to the administration and whose public power were both enormous, was still being handled through a character proxy rather than direct depiction? Is that a sign of remaining personal loyalty to someone the creators had genuinely liked? Is it a different creative judgment about which approach produces better satire in this particular case? Or is it something else entirely? A recognition that Musk's relationship to the administration was complex enough, and his own public persona shifting enough, that a fixed, direct portrait would age less well than a more flexible and indirect approach. Parker and Stone addressed the broader question of their political positioning in multiple interviews during and after season 27. Their consistent position was that they had not become partisan, that they remained genuinely committed to mocking extremism wherever they found it, and that the reason the season focused so heavily on the Trump administration was not that they had chosen sides, but that the administration had made itself into such a dominant cultural presence that engaging with popular culture at all in 2025 meant engaging with it. Parker told the New York Times that the shift was not that we got all political, but that politics became pop culture. Stone described the taboo of criticizing the administration as something they found impossible to ignore, using the same flies to honey language that had served as the show's explanation for why it went after powerful and sensitive targets across its entire history. This framing is consistent with the show's established self-presentation, and there is enough genuine evidence from the show's history to take it seriously rather than dismiss it as simple post hoc rationalization. South Park had spent years producing material that drew complaints from both ends of the political spectrum, mocking liberal celebrities and progressive cultural movements with the same energy it aimed at conservative politicians and religious institutions. The show's equal opportunity claim was not simply a claim. It was documented across decades of material that made enemies on every side of every major cultural divide it examined. The question of whether season 27 represented a genuine departure from that standard or simply reflected a moment when the most available and most interesting satirical targets happened to cluster on one side of the political divide is one that reasonable people disagreed about openly in the coverage the season generated. What makes the Musk dimension of this question specifically interesting is that he sits at an unusual intersection of categories. He is not simply a Trump administration figure, since his connection to that administration was always more complicated and more personal than a standard cabinet appointment. He is not simply a tech billionaire, since his political engagement had moved well beyond the level of financial support or occasional commentary into something that functioned as genuine political participation. He is not simply a cultural figure the show had mocked before, since the personal history between him and the show's creators added a layer of complication that existed in almost no other case across the show's entire history of targeting powerful people. He is all of these things at once, and the show's choice to keep handling him through implication and proxy rather than direct engagement might reflect the genuine difficulty of finding the right satirical frame for someone whose identity in public life had become that layered and that contradictory. There is also a practical dimension to the equal opportunity question that tends to get overlooked in discussions focused primarily on political alignment. South Park's ability to operate, to continue making episodes, and to continue reaching its audience depends on institutional relationships with companies that have their own interests and pressures. The show's new 5-year deal with Paramount, worth a reported $1.5 billion, billion and announced on July 21, 2025, just days before season 27 premiered, was signed at a moment when Paramount itself was navigating a complex merger process with Skydance. Various reports suggested that the deal and the merger both involved considerations about the political environment the company was operating in, with some coverage noting that the timing of the contract signing and the premiere of a season that immediately angered the White House created a genuinely unusual set of corporate and creative pressures operating simultaneously. Parker and Stone publicly addressed this overlap with characteristic brevity, indicating they had signed the deal and then made the show they wanted to make, regardless of what any merger politics might have preferred them to do. The White House's public response to the premiere, sharp and immediate as it was, ended up functioning as a kind of confirmation of the show's broader argument about where creative taboos actually sat in the summer of 2025. Stone had described the current political administration as setting up taboos that he and Parker felt compelled to challenge, and the official government response to a cartoon on Comedy Central criticizing a sitting president constituted remarkably direct evidence that the taboo was exactly as real as he had said it was. A White House that did not feel the criticism as genuinely threatening would not have issued a formal statement about it. The statement's existence and its specific language about the show hanging by a thread was itself a demonstration of the sensitivity the show had located and pressed on. For Musk specifically, the season 27 period represents the fullest expression of a transformation in his relationship with South Park that had been building across more than a decade. The person who tweeted enthusiastically about seeing himself in Handycar in 2014, who voiced himself across 3 episodes in 2016, who attended Matt Stone's social events, and who quoted South Park material in business interviews had become, by 2025, one of the central figures in the political landscape the show was most actively satirizing. The satirical treatment he was receiving was gentler than what was being aimed at other figures in his immediate orbit, delivered through a proxy character rather than direct depiction. But it was satirical treatment nonetheless, and it was being published on his own platform, in his own political moment, by people who had once been close enough to him that the question of what they thought about each other privately felt genuinely significant to the journalists covering the story. Parker and Stone's answer to whether this constituted a departure from their equal opportunity standard was to reject the premise of the question. They maintained, consistently and across multiple interview contexts, that they were not singling out one side while protecting the other. They were responding to what was in front of them, using the tools they had always used, aimed at the targets that presented themselves as most culturally significant and most worth examining at that specific moment. Whether that explanation fully accounts for why Musk continued to receive proxy treatment while figures around him were being named directly is a question the show itself never quite answered. The equal opportunity principle, applied to a situation where one of the targets has a documented personal history with the people applying it, creates a genuine complication that does not resolve cleanly into either accusation of favoritism or complete exoneration from it. What is clear from the entire arc of season 27 and its relationship to Musk's role in public life is that the show had moved definitively past the period when its engagement with him could be described as warm or even neutral. The Handycar era, in which the show treated him as a legitimate figure worth including, and his own response to that treatment was enthusiastic enough to generate a genuine personal connection, was more than a decade in the past by the time Sycophancy aired. The season 20 era, in which he voiced himself and played a supporting role in a storyline that treated his ambitions with something resembling respect, was 9 years gone. What remained was a show posting ketamine memes on his platform, using his most publicly discussed personal controversy as the punchline for a character arc built around a specific kind of adult failure, and doing all of this while maintaining, through the proxy structure of the Randy storyline, just enough formal distance to avoid the conversation becoming entirely about the friendship that used to exist between the people on either side of the joke. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Season 27's engagement with the Trump administration and Musk's role within it told one part of the story, but the show's approach to Musk had never been only about politics, and the deeper question running underneath all of it was something more personal and more specific to how South Park actually works. Section 6. The Billionaire Problem. How South Park Sees Extreme Wealth. The figure South Park returns to most consistently as a satirical subject across its longest and most developed storylines is the person who has accumulated enough money and enough cultural authority to begin operating outside the normal set of social constraints that govern everyone else around them. Politicians appear constantly in the show's run. Celebrities have been lampooned across nearly every season since 1997. But the figure that draws the deepest and most sustained examination is the one for whom the ordinary rules have stopped applying. Not because anyone formally suspended them, but because the scale of their resources and their influence has made the rules functionally optional in ways that nobody ever officially announced, but everybody around them quietly understands. This category of person did not arrive in South Park with Elon Musk. The show had been examining versions of this figure since well before Musk became prominent enough to warrant a cartoon appearance, and the patterns the show established in those earlier examinations created a framework that the Musk storyline fits inside in ways that become clearer when the earlier examples are looked at alongside the more recent material. Understanding how South Park has historically approached extreme wealth and extreme influence helps explain why the transition from the warm handy-car portrait to the pointed ketamine arc followed the specific path it did, and why that path felt internally consistent with the show's own creative logic, even when it might have seemed from the outside like a departure from the personal warmth that had characterized the earlier relationship. One of the show's earliest and most sustained examinations of this territory came through its treatment of corporations and corporate power across multiple seasons. The show had been interested in how large institutions shape individual behavior long before it became specifically interested in the individual figures at the top of those institutions. Episodes built around companies like Walmart, Starbucks Coffee, and various tech platforms examined how the scale of an organization changes its relationship to the communities it operates inside. How something that starts as a local and human-scale activity becomes something different once it grows large enough that individual decisions stop mattering and systemic behavior takes over. These episodes were not primarily interested in the executives running these companies. They were interested in the logic the companies themselves followed, the way that logic spread outward into the behavior of everyone connected to the organization, and the way ordinary people found themselves participating in systems whose overall direction they had never consciously chosen. The shift from examining institutions to examining the specific individuals who run them is one that South Park made gradually and with increasing confidence as the show moved through its later seasons. This shift tracks something that was happening in the broader culture simultaneously, which is the growing public understanding that the most consequential actors in the modern economy were not abstract corporate entities but specific identifiable people whose personal decisions carried enormous consequences for enormous numbers of other people who had no meaningful input into those decisions. The rise of the named tech founder as a cultural figure, someone whose personal story, personal habits, and personal beliefs became inseparable from the public understanding of what their company was and what it represented, created exactly the kind of target South Park has always found most productive to examine. Bill Gates appears in South Park across several episodes, beginning in the show's earliest seasons, and the portrayal established a template that the show would return to repeatedly when dealing with figures at the apex of technological and financial power. Gates in the show is always depicted as someone for whom normal human social behavior has been almost entirely replaced by the logic of competition and market dominance. The joke is not that he is personally evil in some dramatic or colorful sense. The joke is something quieter and in some ways more uncomfortable, that the accumulation of a certain level of power and wealth appears to have disconnected him from the ordinary human considerations that govern how most people relate to the world around them. He does not behave the way normal people behave, not because he has actively chosen cruelty, but because the scale at which he operates has made normal human behavior feel irrelevant to the decisions he is actually making. This template, the powerful figure whose scale of operation has disconnected them from ordinary human social logic, recurs across the show's depictions of multiple tech and business figures over the years. Mark Zuckerberg appears in the show as a character who seems to be performing a learned approximation of human social behavior rather than actually possessing it. Someone who understands intellectually what emotional responses are supposed to look like without having the underlying emotional experience that would generate them naturally. naturally. The joke is specific to the particular kind of public image Zuckerberg had accumulated by the time South Park started including him. The sense that his public appearances and congressional testimonies revealed someone who had studied how humans behave in social situations and was replicating that behavior from the outside without quite landing on the thing that makes it feel genuine. The show pushes this observation to a cartoonish extreme, which is what the show does with everything, but the underlying observation is rooted in something real and recognizable from the actual public record of how Zuckerberg had presented himself across years of public appearances. What South Park consistently finds most interesting about this category of person is not the wealth itself. The show has never been particularly interested in making simple jokes about how much money someone has or what they spend it on. The thing the show finds worth examining is what the accumulation of a certain level of resources and influence appears to do to a person's relationship with accountability. The ordinary person exists inside a dense web of social and institutional checks on their behavior. Other people's opinions matter to them. Consequences follow from their actions in ways they cannot easily avoid. The rules of the systems they operate inside apply to them in concrete and enforceable ways. The person at the level of wealth and influence that South Park tends to find most satirically interesting has moved outside much of that web. Their public image matters to them in a general sense, but the specific social feedback mechanisms that govern ordinary human behavior, the immediate consequences of being seen to behave badly in front of people who have the power to hold you accountable for it, have largely stopped functioning the way they function for everyone else. This is the dimension of extreme wealth that the show has returned to most consistently across its history, and it is the dimension that connects the show's earlier tech billionaire portraits to what it eventually started doing with Musk. The early Musk appearances in HandyCar and Season 20 did not really engage with this territory. The HandyCar version of Musk is someone operating inside a normal competitive landscape, frustrated by a better product, eventually choosing to acquire that product rather than outcompete it, but throughout the episode still recognizably subject to the normal logic of market competition. He loses the race. He buys the service that beat him. These are the actions of someone for whom consequences and competition still function as meaningful inputs into their behavior. The Season 20 version of Musk is even more grounded, a man patiently explaining real technical constraints to characters who want him to solve their problems immediately. Operating in a world where physics and engineering timelines set real limits on what can be done, regardless of how much money or ambition a person brings to the problem. The shift that happened in Musk's public life between 2016 and 2025 is precisely the shift from being someone for whom those kinds of constraints still visibly applied to being someone for whom they appeared to apply much less. The purchase of Twitter for $44 billion and the subsequent management of that platform in ways that generated enormous controversy while producing no obvious accountability for the results established a public image of someone operating largely outside the normal feedback mechanisms that govern most people's behavior in public life. The Doge role and the way that role appeared to function as a mechanism for exerting enormous influence over government operations without the formal accountability structures that normally accompany that level of governmental power reinforced the same impression. The New York Times drug report and Musk's response to it, which amounted to disputing the sourcing while the paper stood by its reporting, was another data point in the same pattern, a situation in which the normal consequences of being publicly reported to have engaged in problematic behavior seem not to function in the ways they would for most other people in public life. South Park's satirical instinct, refined across nearly 3 decades of examining powerful figures, is precisely calibrated to find and examine this specific kind of disconnect. The show does not particularly enjoy mocking powerlessness. Its most sustained and most memorable satire has consistently been aimed at the people and institutions for whom normal accountability has stopped working. The show mocks Scientology in Trapped in the Closet, not because the church is a small or powerless organization, but because it is a large and well-resourced one, whose legal and social infrastructure had been used to suppress public scrutiny. The show mocks Comedy Central's censorship of 201, not because Comedy Central is weak, but because it is powerful enough to silence content it has already produced and paid for, in response to pressure from a tiny group. The target that interests South Park is always the one that should, by normal logic, be accountable for something, but has found a way to avoid that accountability through the resources and the positioning they have accumulated. Musk, by 2025, fit this profile with a completeness that almost none of his earlier appearances in the show's universe had come close to suggesting. The person who lost a race to Timmy's wheelchair-drawn wagon and cheerfully paid $2.3 billion for the rights to the service that beat him was not someone who appeared to be operating outside normal accountability. He was, in that episode, the richest person in the room, but still clearly someone for whom losing a competition had consequences, even if those consequences were denominated in billions rather than in the smaller currencies most people deal in. The person posting on X in 2025 challenging the sourcing of a major investigative newspaper, while the platform he owned amplified his response to hundreds of millions of followers, running a government-adjacent efficiency operation without formal accountability structures, and spending nearly $300 million on a presidential campaign before stepping into a proximity to governmental power that had no clear precedent in American political history, was someone whose relationship to normal accountability had changed dramatically from what it had been when Parker played Dungeons and Dragons with him in 2016. This transformation is the thing that made the shift in South Park's treatment of Musk feel internally consistent to anyone who understood the show's creative logic, even if it appeared inconsistent from the outside to anyone focused primarily on the personal friendship dimension of the story. The show had not changed the standard it was applying. The target had changed relative to that standard. The version of Musk who appeared in HandyCar was genuinely funny as a competitive tech entrepreneur frustrated by an unexpected rival. The version of Musk who arrived in 2025 was interesting to South Park for entirely different reasons. The same reasons the show had always found figures at the extreme outer edge of accountability interesting, because the gap between what that level of power allows someone to do and what normal human social logic would suggest should follow from those actions is wide enough and strange enough to be worth examining through the specific lens of exaggerated cartoon comedy. The Randy Marsh proxy works as well as it does for this particular examination, because Randy has always been the show's avatar for a specific kind of person who believes their own enthusiasm and certainty exempt them from the normal consequences of being wrong. What Tecrity adds to that established character dynamic is the specific texture of someone who has encountered the logic of a world where normal consequences do not apply and decided to import that logic into their own much smaller and more ordinary life. Randy does not actually have the resources to exist outside accountability. His ketamine-fueled rebranding of a failing marijuana farm into an AI-powered platform for global solutions does not produce the kind of insulation from consequence that the actual figures his behavior is modeled on have managed to construct around themselves. The comedy of his situation comes precisely from the gap between the grandiosity of the posture and the smallness of the actual circumstances. He is a middle-aged man in Colorado with a failing business and a nasal spray, performing the ideology of a category of person whose actual situation is nothing like his own. This gap between the performance and the reality is what South Park has always used to examine the ideology of extreme wealth and extreme power. The show cannot put a real tech billionaire into a situation where the consequences of their insulation from accountability become visible in a direct and literal way, because real tech billionaires have insulated themselves from exactly that kind of visibility. What the show can do is put a character who has adopted the surface behaviors and the surface ideology of that category of person into a situation where the absence of real resources makes all of the underlying assumptions visible and ridiculous at the same time. Randy believing that ketamine nasal spray is the secret to tech success is funny because it exposes what the actual ideology of the tech world looks like when stripped of the genuine resources that normally make it possible to sustain the belief. The drug is not the point. The belief that there is a secret accessible through the right substance, the right rebranding, the right vocabulary of disruption and global solutions is the point. And Randy's small-scale version of that belief makes it legible in a way that the full-scale version, operating at the level of actual billions and actual governmental access, sometimes cannot be. This is the specific satirical work that the Tecrity arc accomplished that a more direct portrait of Musk himself might not have been able to achieve. A cartoon of Musk doing ketamine and running Doge would be a joke about a specific person doing specific things. Randy Marsh doing ketamine and rebranding Tecrity Farms is a joke about an entire way of thinking about the relationship between personal behavior and professional ambition, and about what happens to that way of thinking when the extraordinary resources that normally support it are replaced with nothing but confidence and a failing marijuana business. The proxy structure, which had initially seemed like it might simply be a way of maintaining some personal distance from a former acquaintance, turned out to produce something sharper and more durable than a direct portrait would have. It turned a joke about one person into a joke about a category of thinking that one person happened to currently represent at its most visible and most extreme. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The satirical framework the show had been building across decades of examining tech culture and extreme wealth explains how Randy became the right vehicle for this particular joke. But the specific circumstances of where the joke landed, on a platform Musk owned, during a season that was simultaneously making the most direct political statements the show had ever produced. Section 7. Posting on the owner's platform. Free speech and its complications. When Elon Musk completed his purchase of Twitter in October 2022, the stated justification he returned to most consistently in interviews, public statements, and his own post on the platform was free speech. The argument he made, repeated across many different contexts and in many different formulations, was that Twitter under its previous ownership had not been a genuinely neutral platform for public conversation. Certain viewpoints, he argued, had been suppressed. Certain accounts had been penalized or removed for reasons that reflected editorial bias rather than consistent principle. The platform he was purchasing would be different. It would be governed by a commitment to free expression that did not make exceptions based on the political or cultural direction of the content being expressed. This was the vision he articulated, and it was the vision he used to explain why $44 billion was a reasonable price to pay for the ability to implement it. The argument generated enormous debate, both about whether the diagnosis of the old Twitter was accurate and about whether Musk's actual management of the platform once he owned it lived up to the stated principle. Critics pointed to specific decisions made under his ownership that appeared to contradict the free speech framing, including the suspension of accounts belonging to journalists who had been covering his acquisition of the platform, and the removal of certain content that had previously been permitted under the rules he had inherited. Supporters pointed to other decisions that appeared to expand the range of speech permitted on the platform relative to what had been allowed before. The debate about whether the platform under Musk was genuinely more committed to free expression than it had been under previous ownership was one of the most sustained and most unresolved arguments in the ongoing public conversation about what social media platforms owe their users and the public. South Park exists inside this argument in a specific and somewhat unusual way. The show had been using Twitter and then X as an extension of its satirical presence for years before Musk's purchase changed who was running the platform. The account had built a following through a combination of episode clips, character quotes deployed in response to current events, and the occasional piece of content that operated as its own standalone joke rather than simply promoting material from the show itself. The Cartman post from 2022 and the Randy Marsh ketamine meme from 2025 both belong to this category of standalone satirical content, using the platform's format and reach to deliver a point that the episode format alone could not have made in quite the same way. What makes the ketamine meme specifically interesting as an object of analysis is the relationship it establishes between the content of the joke, the identity of the target, and the location where the joke is being delivered. The meme was posted on X. X is owned and controlled by the person the meme is clearly referencing. The meme uses the language of ketamine and tech mogul status to draw a clear line between a fictional character's behavior and a specific real person's most publicly discussed personal controversy. And it does all of this on infrastructure that the real person owns, moderates, and controls according to principles he himself has articulated publicly and at considerable length. The specific irony this creates is not a simple one. If Musk's stated principle is that free speech should be permitted on the platform he owns, then the existence of a meme mocking him directly on that platform is, in one sense, a confirmation that the principle is actually being applied. The content did not get removed, the account did not get suspended, the joke landed, circulated, and generated coverage without any visible interference from the platform's owner or its moderation systems. Under the free speech framing Musk had articulated for X, this is exactly how the platform is supposed to work. Speech critical of powerful figures, including the platform's own owner, should be permitted to exist and to reach an audience on its own merits, without the platform taking sides by suppressing content it finds inconvenient or uncomfortable. This creates a situation with no clean interpretation available. If the meme had been removed or the account penalized, that outcome would have provided clear evidence that Musk's free speech principle did not extend to content critical of himself, which would have been a significant and damaging contradiction of his stated commitment. commitment. The fact that nothing of the sort happened produces a different but equally interesting observation, which is that the platform's owner allowed a pointed and specific piece of satire about his own most embarrassing personal controversy to exist and to spread on infrastructure he controls. Whether that represents genuine commitment to free speech principle, simple indifference to a cartoon that he did not consider worth the attention of an official response, or a calculation that responding would cause more damage than ignoring would, is something nobody outside his immediate circle can determine with any confidence. South Park had been thinking about the relationship between free speech and the platforms that mediate it for a long time before the Musk era made that relationship so personally specific. The show's entire creative philosophy, built around the insistence that no topic and no public figure should be permanently protected from satirical examination, is itself a free speech argument, though one built on creative and ethical grounds rather than legal or corporate ones. Parker and Stone have never framed their commitment to equal opportunity examination as a legal right they are asserting. They have framed it as an editorial standard they hold themselves to, a commitment to consistency that they believe produces better and more honest satire than a standard that makes exceptions for certain targets based on how dangerous or sensitive those targets are. The question of what it means to post on the owner's platform connects to something broader about how power and speech interact in the current media environment, and it is the kind of question South Park has always been drawn to examine, though usually from a step or two removed from the immediate situation. The show had examined media ownership and its relationship to what gets said in several earlier episodes, looking at how the people who control distribution of information shape what information actually reaches an audience and in what form. The Trapped in the Closet storyline, covered in the reference script that informs this video's structure, was itself partly a story about what happens when an institution with enough resources and enough connections can pressure a distribution network into suppressing content that institution dislikes. The Muhammad storyline in 200 and 201 was partly a story about how fear can function as a form of editorial control, producing the same outcome as direct censorship without requiring anyone to issue an explicit order. The X meme situation sits in a genuinely different position relative to those earlier examples. In both of those cases, South Park was on the receiving end of suppression, either directly through network censorship or through the kind of institutional pressure that produced the same result. In the X meme situation, the show is the one choosing to post on a platform whose owner is the subject of the joke, and the suppression that might logically be expected to follow that choice does not materialize. The show is not being silenced, it is operating freely on infrastructure controlled by the person it is criticizing, which is a reversal of the dynamic that had produced some of the show's most significant earlier confrontations with the question of who controls public speech. This reversal is worth examining for what it reveals about how the structure of speech and power had changed in the decade between the 201 controversy and the 2025 ketamine meme. In 2010, a small group posting threats online was able to produce network censorship of a finished episode because the network existed inside a set of legal and institutional relationships that made it vulnerable to pressure from outside. In 2025, South Park was posting direct satirical commentary about the owner of a global communications platform on that platform itself, and no comparable mechanism for suppression appeared to engage. The platform's owner either chose not to use the control he possessed, or the specific dynamics of how X operates made using that control in response to a comedy show's meme feel like an obviously counterproductive move. There is something specifically worth noting about the language the show chose for the meme itself, beyond simply the ketamine reference. The phrase, "just like any tech company, we are expanding our minds by microdosing ketamine," presents the behavior being mocked not as an individual quirk belonging to one specific person, but as an industry norm, something that happens routinely across an entire category of company and person. This framing does something the episode on its own had already been doing through the Randy proxy structure, which is to embed the specific reference inside a broader satirical argument about tech culture generally, rather than making it purely a joke about one individual's personal habits. The meme is aimed clearly at Musk, but it is aimed at him as a representative of something rather than simply as himself, which is consistent with the approach the TechRighty arc had been developing across the season. The phrase expanding our minds by microdosing ketamine also carries a specific kind of irony that connects to the broader free speech dimension of where the meme was being posted. The language of mind expansion has a long history inside countercultural movements that have often framed drug use as a pathway to unconventional thinking and resistance to established authority. Using that same language in the context of a tech billionaire who is simultaneously the establishment against which younger people might once have positioned themselves creates a compressed, satirical observation about how countercultural aesthetics get absorbed into and eventually come to serve structures of power rather than challenge them. This is not an observation unique to South Park or to this specific moment. It is an observation that the show had been making in various forms across its entire history, about how the symbols and language of rebellion consistently get repackaged into products and personas that serve the interests of people who are not actually rebelling against anything. Musk's own public persona had followed this trajectory with unusual visibility. The early version of him that appeared in HandyCar was genuinely a disruptive figure in the specific sense that he was challenging established automotive industry structures with technology that the incumbents were not positioned to match. The framing of Tesla as a company that made electric cars genuinely desirable rather than simply practical or virtuous was a real creative and business achievement that challenged something real. The early SpaceX story, the development of reusable rockets by a private company operating outside the traditional government aerospace contracting world, was a genuine disruption of an established and heavily institutionalized industry. These were the achievements that gave Musk his original cultural status as someone operating outside the normal constraints of established industries, and they were achievements substantial enough to justify that status. By 2025, the same person who had built those companies was now one of the most politically connected figures in the American government, spending hundreds of millions of dollars supporting a presidential campaign, operating a government-adjacent efficiency project with direct access to federal data systems, and using the communications platform he owned to amplify political viewpoints across an audience of hundreds of millions of people. The disruptive outsider had become, by almost any meaningful measure, one of the most powerful insiders in the world. The countercultural aesthetic, the casual dress, the provocative posting, the insistence on being seen as someone who plays by different rules than everyone else remained in place as a surface feature of how he presented himself, while the underlying reality of his position had moved as far from outsider status as it is possible to get without holding elected office. South Park has always been specifically interested in this gap between the identity a person performs and the actual position they occupy. The Rob Reiner episode examined a celebrity activist whose public persona as a champion of public health barely concealed someone willing to deceive and endanger children to advance his cause. The Scientology episode examined an institution whose public presentation as a self-improvement philosophy contained doctrines its own members were not permitted to learn until they had paid enough money to access the inner teachings. The pattern across both of those stories, and across many of the show's sharpest pieces of satire, is the exposure of the distance between the surface presentation and the underlying reality, using the specific tools of exaggeration and absurdity to make that distance visible in a way that straightforward journalism cannot always manage. The ketamine meme on X, posted on the owner's platform about the owner's most discussed personal controversy, was a very compressed version of exactly this kind of exposure. The free speech platform's commitment to free speech was being tested by content critical of the person who articulated that commitment. The disruption-minded outsider was being mocked on infrastructure he owned. The tech mogul, whose public persona still carried the marks of countercultural independence, was being depicted through a character who had adopted the surface behaviors of that persona without any of the underlying resources that make the persona sustainable. Every layer of the joke pointed at the gap between presentation and reality, which is the specific territory South Park has always found most worth occupying. What remained genuinely unresolved by the end of this period was the question of whether the meme's existence on X, and Musk's apparent non-response to it, represented any kind of meaningful interaction between the stated principle of the platform and its actual operation. The absence of suppression is not the same as affirmative endorsement of the content. A platform can permit something to exist without its owner having any particular regard for that content's presence. The free speech principle, if it is being genuinely applied, should produce exactly this outcome, content the owner dislikes remaining up and reaching its audience without interference. But the same outcome could also be produced by simple indifference, or by a calculation about what response would cause the least additional damage to an already complicated public situation. The meme existed on X, that is a fact. What it means about the relationship between the platform, its stated principles, and the person who set those principles is a question the available evidence does not fully resolve. What is clear is that South Park had found a way to use the specific geography of the current media landscape, the ownership structure of X, and Musk's stated commitments about how that platform should function, as part of the joke itself rather than simply as a neutral delivery mechanism for it. The location of the content was doing satirical work alongside the content itself, and that combination of what was being said and where it was being said produced something more layered than either element could have achieved independently. This is the specific kind of move South Park has always made when it is operating at its most deliberate, using every available dimension of a situation rather than simply the most obvious one, and finding in the specific ironies of a moment the material for something sharper and more durable than a simpler approach would have produced. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The platform question raised one dimension of what the South Park and Musk story had become by 2025. But running underneath all of it was a more personal and more unresolved question that the coverage of Sycophancy and the meme had kept returning to without quite answering. Section 8. The friendship question. What happens when the target knows your number? Friendship between a satirist and a public figure is an unusual thing to sustain. The basic logic of satire requires a kind of emotional distance from its subjects, the ability to look at someone's behavior and public position with enough detachment to find what is worth examining and then commit to examining it regardless of how the subject might receive the result. Personal warmth tends to work against that detachment. Knowing someone well enough to have spent a long evening playing a role-playing game with them, knowing what character class they chose and how quickly they decided, introduces a kind of humanizing detail that satire usually functions better without. The more a satirist knows about someone as a person rather than as a public figure, the harder it becomes to treat them purely as a subject rather than as an individual. And the harder that becomes, the harder it becomes to apply the same standard to them that gets applied to everyone else. Parker and Stone have navigated this problem across their careers in ways that most other satirists working in their format have never had to think about. Primarily because the scale of what South Park had become by the mid-2000s meant that the people it depicted were no longer simply strangers the show had decided to examine. The show's cultural prominence made it attractive to certain kinds of public figures who wanted the specific kind of legitimacy that came from being associated with something considered genuinely edgy and genuinely funny rather than simply popular. Being on good terms with South Park, being the kind of person the show treated with something resembling affection rather than contempt, had become a form of cultural capital in certain circles. The people who made the show were aware of this dynamic and had to make ongoing decisions about how to engage with it. The specific history with Musk is documented well enough that its broad outlines are not in dispute. Parker played Dungeons & Dragons with him in 2016 and mentioned it publicly at Comic-Con that same year. Stone attended the party Musk hosted after his Saturday Night Live appearance in 2021. Musk voiced himself across 3 episodes of Season 20, a collaboration that requires active participation and at least some degree of mutual comfort between the people involved. These are not the markers of a purely professional relationship. They describe something with enough social history behind it that the word acquaintance undersells it, and the word friendship, while perhaps overstating the intimacy, captures something real about what the connection actually was. What makes this specific friendship difficult to analyze is the same thing that makes most friendships between people at very different levels of public prominence difficult to analyze from the outside. The public record contains the visible interactions and the documented moments, the tweets and the Comic-Con mentions and the party attendance. It contains almost nothing about the texture of the relationship as actually experienced by the people inside it. How often they were in contact, how much genuine warmth existed beneath the professional and social surface, and what either party actually understood about where the other person stood on the things that mattered most to both of them. The gap between what can be documented and what actually existed is significant, and filling it with speculation is exactly the kind of move that produces more confident-sounding analysis than the available evidence can actually support. What can be said with some confidence is that the relationship, whatever its actual texture, existed at a moment in Musk's public life that preceded most of the changes that eventually made him the specific kind of satirical target South Park found most interesting. The Dungeons & Dragons game happened in 2016, when Musk's public identity was still primarily defined by his companies and their ambitions rather than by his political positioning and his governmental access. The Saturday Night Live party happened in 2021, when he had not yet purchased Twitter and had not yet made the sustained pivot toward political engagement that would define his public presence across the following years. The friendship, such as it was, formed around one version of Musk and had to contend, from the show's side at least, with a substantially different version by the time Sycophancy aired in 2025. This temporal dimension matters because it raises a question that does not have a clean answer. The South Park creators, who had known Musk as a tech entrepreneur who played board games and occasionally voiced himself in cartoon form, were now the same people producing material clearly aimed at a figure whose public behavior had changed significantly from what it had been during the period when the personal connection was at its most active. Whether the friendship continued to function as a genuine social relationship across that period of change, or whether it had faded through natural distance and diverging circumstances before the satirical work even began, is something the public record cannot determine. People who were close in 2016 and 2021 are not necessarily still close in 2025, especially when the paths their lives took in between diverged as dramatically as Parker and Stone's path and Musk's path had diverged across those years. The question of what Musk himself understood about his relationship with the people at South Park is equally difficult to assess from the outside. His continued public references to the show across the period when his own public profile was shifting most dramatically, the 2023 CNBC interview where he quoted Team America, the earlier tweet responding to his season 18 appearance, suggests someone who maintained a genuine personal fondness for the show and its creators, rather than simply treating his connection to them as a professional asset to be deployed occasionally. Whether that personal fondness translated into any kind of ongoing social contact across the years between the SNL party and the Sycophancy meme is not something the public record can confirm. South Park has a documented history of producing satirical material about people who had some kind of personal connection to the show or its creators, though the specific nature and closeness of those connections varied considerably. The show's willingness to go after figures across the entertainment industry who operated in overlapping professional circles with Parker and Stone had been part of its identity since the earliest seasons, when it was still a relatively new show finding its footing in the Comedy Central lineup. The equal opportunity principle, applied consistently, necessarily produces situations where people the creators know or have worked with end up on the receiving end of the same examination aimed at complete strangers. That is what a genuinely applied equal standard actually requires, and the show had always claimed to hold that standard. What made the Musk situation different from most of those earlier cases was the combination of factors involved. The connection was more personal than a typical professional overlap. The target had become more politically significant than most of the show's previous satirical subjects in the entertainment world. And the satirical treatment, when it came, was delivered on infrastructure the target personally controlled, which is a set of circumstances that has no real precedent in the show's earlier history of navigating the space between personal knowledge and satirical examination. Navigating all three of those factors simultaneously while maintaining the show's established creative commitments required a kind of balance that the proxy structure of the Randy Marsh approach was apparently designed to help achieve. The choice to use Randy rather than depicting Musk directly can be read in multiple ways when the friendship dimension is brought into the analysis. One reading, already noted in the coverage the episode received, is that it represents a residual consideration for someone the creators had genuinely liked, a decision to make the satirical point without making it entirely personal by keeping the name out of the episode itself. Another reading is that the proxy structure is actually the sharper creative choice, for reasons that have nothing to do with protecting anyone's feelings and everything to do with what kind of satire is most effective. A third reading, less generous to the show's stated neutrality, is that the residual personal connection produced a softer treatment than the same material would have received if the target had been a complete stranger, regardless of whether the meme the following day partially collapsed the distance the episode had created. None of these readings is straightforwardly wrong. The available evidence is consistent with more than one explanation, which is the ordinary condition of trying to understand why creative decisions get made from outside the room where they were made. What is clear is that the episode existed, the meme existed, and the combination of the two produced the most direct engagement with Musk's personal behavior that the show had made across the entire history of their relationship, while still maintaining a formal structure that left his name out of the episode itself. Whether that combination represents the maximum the friendship would allow, or the minimum the show's creative commitments required, is a question the show itself has not answered directly. Parker and Stone made one set of comments during the season 27 period that comes closest to addressing the friendship question in general terms, though they framed it as a statement about their creative approach rather than as a direct discussion of any particular personal relationship. In interviews following the season premiere and the White House response to it, Stone described the show's willingness to put its own institutional future on the line as evidence of a genuine commitment to the standards they had always claimed to hold. He and Parker, he said, had been willing to lose everything rather than let the calculation of what they might lose determine what they were willing to say. This is a statement about principle rather than a statement about friendship specifically, but applied to the Musk situation, it carries a particular weight. If the show was willing to risk its entire institutional future over its satirical commitments when the pressure was coming from the White House, then the personal history of a board game session would seem unlikely to function as a compelling reason to hold back in a situation where the stakes were considerably lower. The other piece of context that matters here is Musk's own public silence following the episode and the meme. He did not comment publicly on either in ways that generated significant coverage. This silence could mean any number of things. It could mean he found the joke genuinely funny and did not feel the need to respond because there was nothing to defend. It could mean he was aware that any public response would simply amplify coverage of content he found unflattering and chose the strategically quieter option instead. It could mean his relationship with the show and its creators had faded enough by this point that the episode simply did not feel like something requiring a personal reaction, the way a joke from a stranger lands differently than a joke from someone you used to know well. It could mean something else entirely that the available evidence does not point toward. What the silence does not do is resolve the friendship question in either direction. A person who is still genuinely close with someone can choose not to comment publicly on something that person made about them. A person who has drifted entirely away from a former acquaintance can also choose not to comment for completely different reasons. The public record of silence tells very little about the private experience of receiving a ketamine meme on your own platform from people you used to play games with, and any attempt to interpret that silence too confidently in either direction is filling the genuine uncertainty with something more certain sounding than the evidence supports. What the entire arc of the South Park and Musk relationship does illustrate clearly is something about how the show's foundational philosophy interacts with the normal human experience of knowing people personally. The equal opportunity principle, applied consistently, does not actually require its practitioners to be unaware that the person they are examining is someone they have met and spent time with. It requires them to proceed with the examination regardless of that awareness. The awareness might shape the specific form the examination takes, as the proxy structure suggests it may have done in this case, but it cannot, under the terms of the principle itself, function as a reason not to examine at all. A standard that makes exceptions for personal acquaintances is not really a standard. It is a list of approved targets, dressed up in the language of equal treatment. The show had faced versions of this challenge before, though never with exactly this combination of closeness, public significance, and platform-specific irony. Isaac Hayes was not simply a stranger the show had mocked. He was a beloved cast member whose voice had been part of the show since its very first episode. The decision to continue the show after his departure, and to write out his character in a way that addressed the circumstances of that departure, required navigating a personal and professional relationship that had ended under painful and complicated circumstances. South Park did not respond to that situation by treating Hayes' memory with special deference or by softening its examination of the events surrounding his departure. It addressed the situation directly, in the show's own terms, while the real story of what had happened remained largely hidden from the public for years afterward. The parallel is not exact. Hayes was a cast member, not a social acquaintance. His departure was connected to his personal health in ways that made the situation considerably more complicated and more emotionally weighted than a friendship that existed primarily around social events and a creative collaboration across 3 episodes. But the underlying creative logic is similar. The show's identity depends on its willingness to proceed with examination when proceeding is uncomfortable, because the moments when examination is most uncomfortable are typically the moments when it is most worth doing. A show that could only apply its standard to complete strangers strangers would not really be applying a standard at all. It would be applying a convenience, and the distinction between the two is exactly what the show's entire history of controversy had been built around defending. By the time the sycophancy arc was unfolding in the summer and fall of 2025, the relationship between South Park and Elon Musk had traveled an extraordinary distance from its starting point in 2014, when a cartoon version of a tech billionaire lost a race to a wheelchair-drawn wagon and cheerfully paid billions to acquire the service that beat him. The journey from that warm and affectionate portrait to a meme about ketamine nasal spray posted on a platform the target personally owned, while a character modeled unmistakably on his public persona snorted drugs and rebranded a failing marijuana farm as an AI platform for global solutions, traced a path through a decade of genuine change, both in Musk's public identity and in the specific form the show's creative attention took when it turned in his direction. Whether anything of the friendship survived the journey is a question the public record leaves genuinely open, which is perhaps the most honest thing that can be said about a relationship that was always partly private and has remained partly private even as everything surrounding it became extremely public. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The friendship question, open as it remains, points towards something larger about what the entire arc of South Park and Musk reveals about how satire actually works when it operates at this level of cultural proximity. Section 9. The audience reaction. What the fans made of the shift. When South Park changes its relationship to a public figure, the audience tends to notice before anyone writes about it. The show has one of the most attentive and most analytically inclined fan communities of any long-running television program, built up across nearly 3 decades of the kind of viewing that pays close attention to how the show positions itself relative to its targets, rather than simply registering which targets it has chosen. This audience had watched the handycar warmth. They had watched Musk voice himself in season 20. They had seen the Cartman post in 2022. By the time Sycophancy aired in August 2025, a significant portion of the people watching the episode understood the full arc of what they were looking at, and the conversation that followed in the days and weeks after the episode broadcast reflected that understanding in ways that went considerably beyond the usual episode-by-episode reception the show generates. The coverage Sycophancy received was unusual in several respects. Most South Park episodes, even strong ones, generate a relatively contained news cycle. The episode airs, reviews appear within a day or two, social media discussion peaks and then fades, and by the following week, the conversation has moved on to whatever the next episode contains. Sycophancy generated coverage that persisted longer than this typical pattern, partly because of the meme that arrived the day after the episode and redirected attention back to the episode's content just as the initial wave of coverage was beginning to settle. The meme's appearance on X, aimed clearly at the platform's owner, gave journalists and commentators a second entry point into the story that did not require simply repeating what had already been written about the episode itself. It introduced a new angle, the platform irony, which produced its own separate round of coverage with its own separate set of observations. The specific piece of context that made Sycophancy coverage different from most South Park episode coverage was the Dungeons and Dragons detail. Multiple outlets covering the episode's apparent reference to Musk noted the personal history between Musk and Parker, with several pieces built around the question that one publication framed most directly in its headline, asking whether Parker and Musk would remain friendly after an episode whose satirical target was so clearly connected to Musk's most publicly discussed personal controversy. This framing transformed what might otherwise have been a straightforward piece of topical satire into something with a personal narrative dimension that made it more interesting to general audiences than an episode about tech culture and ketamine would normally be. The friendship backstory gave the episode a story underneath the story, and journalism tends to find that kind of layering irresistible. The fan community's response divided along lines that the broader critical conversation about season 27 had also been following. The season had been drawing record viewership by the standards of the show's most recent years, with the Trump-focused premiere and the subsequent episodes generating audience numbers that the network was publicly noting as evidence of a genuine resurgence in the show's cultural relevance. Some of this audience was watching because the Trump material was connecting with viewers who felt that South Park was now saying something they wanted said, by a show with enough established credibility and enough history of attacking both sides to say it without being dismissed as straightforwardly partisan. Others were watching with a more complicated set of feelings, including longtime fans who had appreciated the show precisely for its willingness to mock both political movements, and who were uncertain about whether the season 27 focus represented a genuine creative creative response to the current moment or a drift toward a more comfortable political alignment. The Musk dimension of the season landed differently depending on which of these viewing positions someone came from. Viewers who were primarily watching because of the show's Trump-era political engagement tended to receive the Tecrity arc and the Sycophancy episode as part of a coherent satirical project aimed at the constellation of figures around the current administration, with Musk as a natural and obvious target given his connection to Doge and his financial support for the campaign that had produced the administration being satirized. For this group, the question of whether a board game history between Parker and Musk made the episode somehow inappropriate or complicated tended not to generate much sympathy. The show had always been willing to go after figures with whom its creators had some kind of connection, and the argument that personal fondness should insulate a public figure from satirical examination was precisely the kind of argument the show had spent 3 decades rejecting. Viewers coming from a more skeptical position about the season's overall direction had a different response. For longtime fans who had found the show's historical neutrality to be one of its most valuable qualities, the combination of the heavily Trump-focused season 27 and the indirect Musk satire raised questions about whether the show's equal opportunity principle was being genuinely applied, or whether it had been allowed to bend in the direction of whatever political winds were blowing most strongly in 2025. This group tended to note that while Randy Marsh was doing ketamine and running a fake tech company, the show had not produced comparably sustained satirical material aimed at figures on the other side of the political divide in the same season with the same energy. The question this raised was not whether Musk deserved satirical attention, since the material about him was sharp enough that most viewers found it funny regardless of their political position. The question was whether the overall balance of the season reflected the equal opportunity standard the show claimed to hold. Parker and Stone's response to this criticism, given across multiple interviews during and after the season, was consistent with positions they had taken across the show's entire history, when similar accusations of imbalance had been raised from different political directions in different eras. They were not, they insisted, more interested in one side than the other. They were interested in wherever the most interesting satirical material was currently located. And in the current moment, that material happened to cluster heavily in one particular direction because of how completely the administration had saturated every dimension of American cultural life. The argument that they should produce equally distributed satire, regardless of where the most interesting material actually sat, struck them, based on their stated position, as a form of artificial balance that would compromise the quality of the work without actually demonstrating any deeper commitment to fairness. Real equal opportunity, under their definition, means applying the same willingness to examine wherever examination seems worth doing, not producing a predetermined quantity of material aimed at each side of a political divide to satisfy an external standard of apparent neutrality. This argument is not obviously wrong, and it had enough historical support from the show's actual record to be taken seriously rather than dismissed as convenient rationalization. Across the show's long run, the targets that had drawn its most sustained and most pointed attention had shifted significantly from era to era, reflecting not a consistent partisan alignment, but a consistent interest in wherever the most culturally significant and most examination-resistant targets were currently located. The woke culture material of seasons 19 through 22 had drawn sustained criticism from the political left, with some commentators arguing that the show had become primarily a vehicle for mocking progressive cultural movements while giving conservative politics a relative pass. The season 27 and 28 Trump material drew the equivalent criticism from the right, with some commentators making essentially the mirror image of the earlier argument. The show being criticized from both directions across different periods does not prove that it is always perfectly balanced, but it does suggest that the criticism of imbalance tends to reflect the critic's position more than the show's actual record. The Musk-specific dimension of the audience response also revealed something interesting about how his public image had shifted between the groups that make up South Park's viewership. The tech enthusiast audience that had watched the season 18 and season 20 appearances with particular interest, drawn to the show's engagement with the electric vehicle industry and the SpaceX program, had its own complicated response to the Tecrity arc that differed from both the broadly political responses described above. For viewers whose interest in Musk was primarily rooted in his companies and their achievements rather than in his political positioning, the shift from the show treating him as a legitimate figure in the technology world to treating him as a stand-in for tech culture culture's worst impulses, represented a genuinely different kind of change than a political realignment. The earlier episodes had engaged with what Musk was building. The sycophancy material engaged with what he had become as a cultural figure, and those two things, while connected through the same person's biography, were different enough subjects to produce different responses in different parts of the audience. The broader cultural significance of season 27's record viewership numbers sits in an interesting relationship with the Musk material specifically. The season was pulling audiences significantly larger than the show had been drawing in its immediately preceding years, a fact that the network acknowledged publicly and that coverage attributed to the show's engagement with the Trump era's particular intensity as a source of satirical material. What this meant in practical terms was that the Musk references, delivered through Randy's arc across multiple episodes, were reaching more people than any South Park content had reached in some time. The show that had once had a cozy enough relationship with Musk that he voiced himself across 3 episodes was now producing content clearly aimed at him and delivering it to a larger audience than it had assembled in years. The irony of the scale expansion happening at precisely the moment when the relationship had shifted from warm to pointed did not go unremarked in the coverage the season generated. The response from the Trump administration to season 27 also created a secondary effect on how the Musk material was received by audiences. The White House statement describing the show as hanging by a thread drew significant attention to the season as a whole, functioning as exactly the kind of official disapproval that tends to increase rather than decrease audience interest in a piece of satirical work. People who had not been watching South Park for years found their way to season 27 partly because the administration's reaction suggested there was something worth seeing. This expanded audience encountered the Musk material alongside the Trump material, without necessarily having the full backstory of the Dungeons & Dragons game and the season 20 collaboration, which meant they were engaging with the Tecrity arc primarily as political satire about a Trump-adjacent figure, rather than as the complicated personal narrative that longtime fans understood it to contain. This difference in how new and returning audiences received the Musk material is itself a small illustration of something the show had examined repeatedly across its history, through the lens of how satire travels once it leaves the hands of its creators. The Ginger Kids example from the reference script attached to this project is the most dramatic version of this phenomenon, where material built to make one argument gets absorbed by part of its audience as something entirely different. The Musk material did not suffer any comparable misreading. The basic joke was legible regardless of how much backstory the viewer brought to it, but the layer of the joke that involved the personal history between Parker and Musk, and what that history meant for how the satirical treatment should be understood, was genuinely accessible only to people who already knew it existed. For everyone else, the episode was about tech culture and ketamine. For the fraction of the audience who had been following the full arc since 2014, it was also about something more personal and more specific to how South Park navigates the space between its stated principles and its actual relationships. The critical reception of Sycophancy was largely positive, with reviewers noting the effectiveness of the Randy proxy structure and the precision of the tech culture satire. One reviewer described Randy's transformation into a ketamine-snorting tech bro as the episode's most valuable performance, noting that the 2 running jokes connected to his character, the ChatGPT emotional support and the ketamine regimen, never got old across the episode's runtime, generating consistent laughs each time they returned. The Guardian published a piece describing the episode as satire at its finest and connecting it to the season's broader engagement with the Trump administration's tech billionaire adjacency as a defining feature of the current political moment. The consensus across most critical coverage was that the episode worked both as a standalone piece of comedy and as part of the season's ongoing examination of how wealth, political access, and an ideology of disruption interact to produce a particular kind of public figure whose behavior has become culturally significant enough to require satirical attention. The Screen Rant ranking of season 27 episodes placed Sycophancy among the season's strongest entries, specifically citing Randy's arc as the most successful element, and noting that the show's willingness to take on the tech industry's self-mythologizing at a moment when that mythology was most directly connected to actual governmental power gave the episode a relevance that pure comedy about drug use or AI sycophancy would not have achieved on its own. This assessment captures something genuine about why the episode landed as well as it did. The ketamine joke works as a character joke about Randy's particular kind of self-delusion. It works as a tech culture joke about about the specific aesthetics of Silicon Valley's relationship to unconventional productivity methods, and it works as a pointed reference to a real public figure whose personal controversies had made that combination of details immediately recognizable to anyone following the news. All three of those levels function simultaneously, which is what the show's best satire has always managed to achieve. The audience reception of the meme itself, posted on X the day after the episode aired, generated a response that was somewhat different from the episode coverage in its texture and its tone. Social media responses to the meme tended toward the sharper and more politically direct end of the spectrum that episode reviews typically avoid, with users on X itself making connections between the meme, its location, and Musk's stated principles about the platform more directly and more combatively than professional critics generally chose to do. The irony of the location was the subject that generated the most engagement within that conversation, with users noting various dimensions of the paradox involved in a satirical meme about the platform owner existing and circulating freely on the platform owner's own infrastructure. Some of this conversation was simply delighted by the irony. Some of it was more pointed, using the meme's existence as evidence for arguments about Musk's public persona that went well beyond anything South Park itself had said in either the episode or the meme. This extension of the satire beyond what the show itself had intended or stated is a pattern South Park had encountered repeatedly across its history, and it connects directly to the concerns the show's creators have expressed across their careers about how satirical material travels once it leaves the context its creators controlled. The show had not made arguments about Musk's fitness for governmental roles, or about the broader implications of his drug use for his professional judgment, or about the relationship between his political spending and his governmental access. It had made a joke about ketamine and tech culture through a character proxy. The audience, particularly the portion of the audience engaging through social media, extended those jokes into arguments the show had not made, using the satirical material as a launching point for commentary that went considerably further than the episode or the meme had themselves gone. This is neither a failure of the satire nor a validation of it. It is simply what happens when comedy about real and contested subjects reaches an audience already engaged with those subjects through other contexts. The net effect of the Sycophancy episode and its aftermath on South Park's relationship with its audience was to confirm something that the season 27 premiere had already suggested, which is that the show's willingness to engage directly with the most significant and most contested targets in the current cultural landscape had reconnected it with a level of cultural relevance that the show's more recent years had not consistently maintained. The record viewership numbers were not simply a reflection of the Trump material. They were a reflection of the sense, shared across a large and varied audience, that South Park was once again making decisions that felt genuinely risky and genuinely committed, rather than calculated and safe. The Musk material contributed to that sense, partly because of its own satirical precision, and partly because the backstory of the personal connection made the show's willingness to proceed feel like evidence of a real creative commitment, rather than simply an easy political target being picked off from a comfortable distance. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The audience understood, in varying degrees of detail, what the show had done and what it cost to do it. What remained was the larger question underneath all of it, the one that the entire decade-long arc of South Park and Elon Musk had been building toward, without ever quite stating directly. Section 10. The Standard and the Person. What the whole arc actually reveals. Telling this story in its simplest form takes only a single paragraph. A famous satirical show made friends with a tech billionaire, treated him warmly for a decade, then turned its attention toward him as his public behavior changed, using a character proxy to deliver pointed commentary while maintaining just enough formal distance to avoid the situation becoming entirely about the personal history involved. That version is accurate as far as it goes. It captures the basic sequence of events and the general shape of the relationship. What it does not capture is what the sequence reveals about the show's foundational argument, and whether that argument held together across the decade of change that separated the handy-car warmth from the tech-riddy meme. South Park's equal opportunity philosophy is one of the most consistently stated and most consistently tested creative commitments in the history of American television comedy. Parker and Stone have repeated it across nearly 3 decades of interviews, panel discussions, public statements, and the episodes themselves, where characters like Kyle have been given given the task of articulating the argument directly when the show wants to make it as plainly as the format will allow. The argument is not complicated in its basic form. Nobody should be permanently protected from satirical examination. The list of acceptable targets should never be finished. The moment a list like that gets finished, with certain people or institutions placed permanently outside the reach of the show's examination because of how dangerous or sensitive or personally connected they happen to be, the entire credibility of the philosophy collapses. What remains is not equal opportunity. It is a more comfortable arrangement with a philosophical label attached to it. And the difference between those two things is exactly what the show's history of controversy had been built around defending. The Musk arc tests this philosophy more precisely than almost any other story in the show's recent history, because it tests it against the one variable that most of the show's earlier controversies never introduced. The Scientology episode was built entirely around a target the creators had no personal warmth for. The Muhammad storyline involved an institution whose reaction created genuine physical danger for the people making the show, which is a different kind of pressure than the social and emotional pressure of satirizing someone you have spent evenings with. The Parents Television Council spent 30 years opposing the show without anyone at South Park having any particular personal regard for the organization or its leadership. Even Isaac Hayes, whose departure generated the most personal and painful controversy in the show's earlier history, was a cast member and colleague rather than a social friend whose company Parker had sought out independently. Musk was different, specifically because the connection that existed between him and the show's creators was not professional in its origin. It was social. It arose from mutual interest and mutual regard between people who had no formal obligation to spend time with each other and chose to do so anyway. That specific kind of connection is harder to set aside when the creative work requires setting it aside. Not because professional obligations are easier to manage than personal ones, but because the professional relationship comes with built-in structures that make the eventual distance easier to navigate. A cast member who leaves under difficult circumstances produces grief and professional disruption. A friend whose public behavior requires satirical examination produces something more ambiguous and more personally specific, something that the equal opportunity principle can address logically without fully resolving emotionally. The show's response to this specific challenge, the proxy structure of the Randy Marsh approach, represents a genuinely interesting creative solution to a genuinely difficult problem. By keeping Musk's name out of the episode while making the reference unmistakable through specific behavioral and contextual details, and then using the meme to collapse the formal distance the episode had created, the show managed to make its satirical point with enough specificity that nobody missed it, while maintaining enough structural separation that the episode itself was about something broader than one person's personal controversies. Randy becoming a ketamine-snorting tech bro on the advice of a sycophantic AI is a complete satirical idea on its own terms, functional as comedy and as cultural commentary, regardless of whether the viewer brings any knowledge of the show's history with the figure being referenced. The Musk connection deepens it. The episode does not require it. This combination, satirical material that works as a standalone idea while also functioning as a specific reference to a real and clearly identifiable person, is one of the show's most sophisticated techniques when it is operating at its best, and it has appeared across the show's history in forms that did not involve the additional complication of personal friendship. The Butt Out episode worked this way, using Rob Reiner as a direct named target, while the broader satirical argument about celebrity activists and the public health crusade they had appointed themselves to lead was legible and functional even in episodes that did not feature him specifically. The Banned in China episode names Disney directly, while the broader argument about corporate compromise in the Chinese market applied across an entire industry. The Musk material in season 27 follows this same pattern but adds the layer of personal history to a technique the show had already developed and refined across multiple earlier episodes and multiple earlier targets. What the decade-long arc from Handycard to Sycophancy ultimately reveals about the equal opportunity philosophy is not that the philosophy was abandoned or compromised under the pressure of personal connection. The satirical examination happened. The meme was posted on the target's own platform. The coverage that followed treated the episode as a genuine and pointed piece of satirical work aimed at a real and recognizable figure, which is exactly what it was. The philosophy held in the sense that it produced the examination the philosophy requires, applied to a target who happened to have a personal history with the people doing the applying. What the arc reveals is something subtler and more interesting than a simple question of whether the principle held or bent. It reveals that the principle, applied in this specific set of circumstances, does not produce produce a clean or comfortable outcome the way it sometimes does when the target is a complete stranger. It produces something messier and more human, a satirical examination that clearly happened, but that left enough questions about its specific form, the proxy structure, the indirectness of the episode itself, the reliance on the meme to complete what the episode left formally open, that even sympathetic observers were left uncertain about whether the full force of the show's normal satirical commitment had been brought to bear, or whether the personal history had shaped the specific approach in ways that amounted to a partial accommodation rather than a full and unqualified application of the standard. That uncertainty is itself worth sitting with, because it points towards something true about how the equal opportunity principle actually functions in practice rather than in theory. In theory, the principle is absolute. Nobody is protected. The list is never finished. The connection between the satirist and the subject is irrelevant. In practice, the human beings who hold and apply the principle are human beings, shaped by their own social histories and their own emotional responses to the specific people and institutions they are examining. And those human dimensions do not disappear simply because a principle has been stated clearly and held consistently across decades of public professional commitment. The question of whether the Randy proxy represents a genuine creative choice that produced better satire than a direct portrait would have, or whether it represents the specific form a personal accommodation takes when people who built a philosophy around refusing accommodations are faced with the one target who knows their number, is a question that has no verifiable answer from outside the room where those decisions were made. Parker and Stone themselves have provided the closest thing to an answer available in the public record, through their consistent framing of the season 27 material as a response to creative opportunity rather than personal feeling. They did not, in any of the interviews generating coverage during and after the season, describe the Musk-adjacent material as something they found personally difficult to make. They described the season's overall direction as a response to where the most interesting and most taboo-breaking satirical territory was currently located, and they described their decision to proceed with material that angered the White House as evidence of a genuine commitment to the principle that the size of the risk involved in doing something is the most reliable signal that the thing is worth doing. Under this framing, the Musk material was simply part of the broader landscape the season was examining, shaped by creative judgment rather than by personal history. This framing is consistent with the show's stated position, and consistent with the evidence available in the public record. It is also the framing that a show genuinely committed to equal opportunity would offer regardless of whether the specific decisions about the Musk material had involved any personal accommodation, because acknowledging that a personal history had shaped a creative decision would undermine the principle the show has built its identity around holding. The framing and the principle align in a way that makes the framing unfalsifiable from the outside, which is not the same as making it false. It simply means the available evidence cannot determine whether the alignment is genuine or strategic. What can be assessed more confidently is the cumulative effect of the decade-long arc on the show's relationship with the equal opportunity argument itself. The argument had been tested against religious institutions powerful enough to pursue real legal consequences. It had been tested against governments capable of erasing the show from their country's internet. It had been tested against the show's own network when that network chose to censor a finished episode rather than broadcast it as delivered. Each of those tests produced a clear and documented response, either the show proceeding regardless of the consequences, or the show being censored and then immediately making its objection to that censorship public. The responses were sharp and unambiguous, leaving no genuine uncertainty about where the show stood relative to the pressure being applied. The Musk test is different because it does not produce that kind of clarity. The satire happened, which is a point for the principle. The form the satire took left questions open that the principle in its stated form would not leave open, which is a point for the argument that personal history shaped the approach in ways the principle does not formally permit. Both of these things are true simultaneously, which is the specific condition that makes the Musk arc more interesting and more revealing than most of the show's earlier controversies. Not because it represents a failure of the principle, but because it represents the principle encountering a test complex enough to produce an outcome that cannot be assessed cleanly. The show that began in 1997 with 4 foul-mouthed third graders in a small Colorado town built its identity on the refusal to be comfortable. The discomfort it generated came from different sources at different points across its history, from religious institutions and foreign governments and legal threats and network censorship, and the sustained opposition of a well-funded advocacy organization that eventually went bankrupt trying to outlast it. The Musk arc adds one more specific variety of discomfort to that list: the discomfort of applying a stated principle to someone the principle's own holders had reasons to want to treat differently, and proceeding with the application regardless of those reasons, in a form that accomplished the satirical work while leaving enough formal ambiguity that the question of how fully the standard was applied would remain genuinely open for anyone paying close enough attention to ask it. That combination, proceeding with examination while leaving the question of the examination's completeness genuinely open, is not a triumph of the equal opportunity principle in the clean and unambiguous way that posting a cartoon of Muhammad and then refusing to apologize for it represents a triumph. It is something more modest and more human. A show doing the best version of what its own stated commitments required in a set of circumstances its stated commitments were not designed with any particular precision to address. The principle says nobody is permanently protected. The Musk arc proves that nobody was permanently protected, including someone who played board games with Trey Parker in 2016 and voiced himself in cartoon form shortly afterward. Whether the specific form the examination eventually took represents the fullest possible application of that principle, or a version of it shaped by the particular pressures of a specific personal history, is a question the show has not answered, and may not be positioned to answer, given that the most honest answer would require acknowledging dimensions of the decision that the principle itself suggests should not exist. What the audience, the critics, and the broader cultural conversation around South Park versus Elon Musk took from the arc is perhaps the most useful measure of what the arc actually accomplished as a piece of satirical work. The episode was sharp enough to generate genuine and sustained coverage. The meme was pointed enough to produce its own separate round of attention. The friendship backstory added a layer of personal narrative that made the material more interesting to a broader audience than pure topical satire about tech culture would have been on its own. The location of the meme on Musk's own platform added an ironic dimension that connected the satirical content to the show's own long history of examining free speech, censorship, and who gets to decide what can be said and where. And the whole arc, from HandyCar in 2014 to the season 27 material in 2025, told a story about how a public figure can travel far enough from where they started that the same show that treated them warmly in one era finds itself, without any change in its own stated principles, producing material that lands very differently by the time the next decade has run its course. South Park has never claimed to be a perfect instrument. Parker and Stone have acknowledged across their careers that the show gets things wrong, misjudges targets, produces episodes that do not work as well as intended, and occasionally generates consequences it did not anticipate and would not have chosen. The equal opportunity philosophy has never been presented as a guarantee of perfect execution. It has been presented as a commitment to a standard, applied as consistently as the people holding the standard can manage across the full range of circumstances the show encounters. The Musk arc tested that standard in the specific and unusual set of circumstances created by a personal history that the standard was not originally designed to address, and produced an outcome that was consistent with the standard's basic requirements while leaving enough complexity in its specific form that the story of how the test was navigated will remain genuinely interesting for anyone who cares about how satire actually works when it has to work in the real and complicated world rather than in the clean theoretical space where equal opportunity principles are easiest to state and hardest to fully apply. The show that spent a decade moving from a warm cartoon race involving a Tesla and a wheelchair-drawn wagon to a meme about ketamine nasal spray posted on the target's own platform had not changed its argument across that decade. The argument was the same at the end as it had been at the beginning. What changed was the distance between the person the argument was being applied to and the people applying it, and the specific form that application eventually took when the distance that should always have existed between a satirist and a subject had to be reconstructed out of personal history and creative decision-making rather than simply assumed from the start. That reconstruction, imperfect and formally ambiguous as it may have been, is what the whole arc ultimately reveals. And it reveals it not as a failure of the show's foundational commitment, but as the specific shape that commitment takes when it is tested by the one circumstance that makes it hardest to hold, the circumstance where the target knows your number and you proceed anyway. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.